Behind the fences and guard towers of Auschwitz stood a brick building known simply as Block 10. From the outside, it appeared smaller and quieter than many other sections of the camp. The windows remained closed. Movement around the building was tightly controlled. Prisoners passing nearby often knew very little about what was happening inside. Yet within those rooms, some of the most disturbing medical experiments conducted in Auschwitz unfolded in near-total secrecy. Block 10 became a place where imprisoned women were subjected to sterilization procedures, gynecological experiments, infections, injections, and operations carried out without consent under the authority of Nazi doctors seeking methods tied to racial policy and medical control. Many of the women imprisoned there arrived already weakened by the conditions of the camp system itself. Inside the block, they entered an environment defined by fear, observation, uncertainty, and physical suffering. Unlike the industrial labor compounds or overcrowded prisoner barracks elsewhere in Auschwitz, Block 10 carried a quieter and more isolated atmosphere. The routines inside revolved around examinations, selections, medical procedures, and constant supervision. Prisoners living there often existed in a state of uncertainty, never fully knowing when another procedure, inspection, or transfer might occur. At the same time, Block 10 existed within the larger structure of Auschwitz itself, connected to the camp systems of administration, ideology, and medical experimentation. The building became one of the clearest examples of how science, bureaucracy, and authoritarian control were combined inside the Nazi camp system during the Second World War. In this documentary, we will explore the environment inside Block 10, the daily routines surrounding the experiments, the experiences of the imprisoned women, the role of Nazi doctors and prisoner medical staff, and the lasting historical significance of one of the most secretive buildings inside Auschwitz. And before we begin, take a moment to like this video, subscribe to In&Out Nazi Germany, and let me know in the comments where in the world you're watching from. Every story, every memory, and every place matters. And together we keep history alive. Now let's begin. Chapter 1, Segment 1. The Arrival into Block 10. As one considers the first moments experienced by women brought into Auschwitz Block 10, it becomes evident that the transition into the building carried a distinct atmosphere of uncertainty, fear, and isolation shaped by the secrecy surrounding its operation, and as this develops, the relationship between the physical structure of the block and the psychological environment inside. It becomes increasingly central to understanding daily life within the building, where entry into Block 10 did not resemble movement into an ordinary prisoner barrack, but instead into a restricted medical space operating under constant supervision and tightly controlled routine, and this difference shaped the experience of those who crossed its doors, and as one reflects on the physical appearance of Block 10 itself, it becomes clear that the building stood apart from many surrounding camp structures through both its function and atmosphere, where brick walls, shuttered windows, guarded entrances, and limited movement created an environment marked by secrecy and separation from the broader rhythms of Auschwitz, and this physical isolation reinforced the sense that Block 10 existed as a concealed section of the camp connected to activities many prisoners elsewhere barely understood, and as this develops further, the role of uncertainty becomes increasingly significant, where women transferred into the building often possessed limited information regarding what would happen inside, and this absence of knowledge shaped the emotional atmosphere immediately upon arrival by surrounding the environment with fear and speculation, and this uncertainty became one of the defining conditions of life inside Block 10 itself. And as we consider the sensory aspects of entering the building, it becomes evident that the atmosphere differed noticeably from the crowded industrial labor compounds and ordinary barracks elsewhere in Auschwitz, where quieter hallways controlled movement, footsteps echoing through enclosed rooms, whispered exchanges between prisoners, distant medical activity, and prolonged silence created an environment carrying tension beneath. Its apparent order and this sensory atmosphere reinforced awareness that Block 10 operated according to routines different from the visible labor systems dominating much of the camp, and, as this develops, the relationship between medicine and authority becomes increasingly apparent, where examinations, registration procedures, and medical inspections occurred within structures shaped entirely by camp administration and ideological objectives rather than ordinary patient care, and this integration transformed the meaning of medical space itself inside Block 10, where treatment and experimentation existed together under systems of coercion and control, and as one reflects on the broader implications, it becomes evident that the building functioned not merely as a medical ward but as part of the wider machinery of Auschwitz, where scientific experimentation, racial ideology, administrative organization, and prisoner confinement became interconnected within one controlled environment, and this broader role shaped every aspect of daily existence inside the block, and as this develops further, the role of observation becomes increasingly central, where newly arrived prisoners quickly learn to interpret routines, movements of guards and doctors, behavior of prisoner orderlies, and the atmosphere surrounding examinations in order to understand the environment around them, and this dependence upon careful observation reflected the broader survival strategies required throughout Auschwitz itself. And as we consider the perspective of women entering Block 10 for the first time, it becomes clear that the building carried an atmosphere suspended between visible routine and hidden threat, where ordinary medical procedures appeared alongside growing awareness that the block functioned according to purposes extending far beyond treatment alone, and this awareness shaped memory of the building long after the war, and as this develops, the connection between secrecy, medicine, and psychological uncertainty becomes increasingly interconnected, where each element reinforced the others in shaping the environment of Block 10, and thus arrival into the building can be understood as entry into one of the most controlled and isolated spaces within Auschwitz, where medical authority, administrative secrecy, and fear combined to define the first experiences of imprisoned women inside the block. As women spent more time inside Block 10 following their arrival, the routines and atmosphere of the building gradually revealed the deeper structures shaping daily existence within the experimental ward, and it becomes evident that life inside the block unfolded according to patterns of supervision, examination, waiting, and uncertainty that differed from the industrial labor routines operating across much of Auschwitz, and as this develops, the relationship between confinement and medical procedure becomes increasingly significant, where prisoners lived within an environment organized around inspections, controlled movement, and repeated examinations tied directly to the experimental purposes of the block, and this structure transformed ordinary daily life into a continuous state of observation and anticipation, and as one reflects on the internal organization of Block 10, it becomes clear that the building operated through tightly controlled spatial divisions, where rooms, examination areas, sleeping quarters, and corridors structured movement according to schedules and administrative priorities established by camp authorities and medical personnel, and this organization reinforced the sense that prisoners existed within a system governed entirely through institutional control and restricted autonomy, and as this develops further, the role of silence becomes increasingly apparent, where periods of waiting inside crowded rooms, quiet exchanges between prisoners, movement of doctors through corridors, and uncertainty surrounding upcoming procedures created a subdued atmosphere filled with tension, and this silence differed from the louder industrial environment elsewhere in Auschwitz by emphasizing fear, expectation, and emotional exhaustion rather than physical labor alone, and as we consider the sensory aspects of daily life. Inside Block 10, it becomes evident that the building carried an atmosphere shaped by enclosed spaces, footsteps in hallways, opening doors, medical equipment, whispered conversations, and the constant awareness that examinations or selections could occur at unpredictable moments. And this sensory environment reinforced the psychological pressure surrounding the block by making uncertainty part of ordinary routine itself, and as this develops, the relationship between prisoner, medical staff, and the environment becomes increasingly central, where inmate nurses, assistants, and doctors often occupied difficult positions inside the block, attempting to navigate systems of authority while interacting directly with imprisoned women subjected to experiments and examinations, and these interactions shaped many of the daily routines inside Block 10 even within the severe limitations imposed by the camp system, and as one reflects on the broader implications, it becomes evident that Block 10 represented one of the clearest examples of how medical authority and concentration camp administration became deeply interconnected under Nazi rule, where scientific procedures were carried out within a structure built upon coercion, imprisonment, and racial ideology, and this integration transformed the medical environment itself into an instrument of institutional control, and as this develops further, the role of psychological uncertainty becomes increasingly interconnected with physical confinement, where prisoners inside the block often lacked clear information regarding future procedures, transfers, or outcomes, and this absence of certainty shaped the emotional atmosphere of the building by surrounding ordinary routines with constant fear and anticipation. And as we consider the perspective of women living inside Block 10 over extended periods, it becomes clear that the building existed as both a medical facility and a place of deep isolation within Auschwitz, where routine examinations, restricted movement, and experimental procedures created an environment marked by secrecy and emotional strain, and this perception contributed strongly to later memory of the block as one of the most feared and mysterious sections of the camp. And as this develops, the connection between medical routine, psychological pressure, and systems of supervision becomes increasingly interconnected, where each element reinforced the others in shaping the atmosphere of daily life inside the building, and thus Block 10 can be understood as a controlled environment where medicine, confinement, secrecy, and uncertainty merged together within one of the most disturbing experimental spaces inside Auschwitz. Chapter 1, Segment 2. Daily Life Inside Block 10. As one considers the daily routines inside Auschwitz Block 10, it becomes evident that life within the building unfolded through patterns of waiting, examination, supervision, and uncertainty that created an atmosphere distinct from many other areas of the camp. And as this develops, the relationship between routine and psychological pressure becomes increasingly central to understanding the environment inside the block, where ordinary activities such as waking, movement through corridors, medical inspections, meals, and periods of confinement occurred beneath constant awareness that examinations or experimental procedures could interrupt daily life at any moment, and this uncertainty shaped the emotional atmosphere surrounding every routine within the building. And as one reflects on the physical organization of Block 10, it becomes clear that the structure itself reinforced control and observation, where rooms were arranged according to medical and administrative priorities, hallways restricted movement, doors separated examination areas from living quarters, and windows often remained covered or partially closed, creating an enclosed atmosphere that emphasized isolation from the outside world of Auschwitz beyond the block itself, and this physical separation contributed strongly to the psychological character of the building, and as this develops further, the role of repetition becomes increasingly significant, where women imprisoned inside Block 10 experience days structured through recurring medical rounds, inspections, cleaning duties, waiting periods, and movement between rooms under guard supervision, and this repetitive rhythm created an environment where time itself seemed suspended between procedures and uncertainty regarding future developments, and as we consider the sensory aspects of the block, it becomes evident that Block 10 carried a subdued but deeply tense atmosphere shaped by footsteps echoing through corridors, quiet voices between prisoners, opening doors, sounds of medical equipment, movement of guards and doctors, and long stretches of silence interrupted only by sudden administrative activity, and this sensory environment reinforced awareness that the building operated according to hidden routines not fully visible to those confined inside it, and as this develops, the relationship between illness and fear becomes increasingly apparent, where many women inside Block 10 suffered from weakness, infection, pain, or exhaustion connected to procedures and camp conditions, and these physical realities shaped daily life by surrounding ordinary routines with visible signs of suffering and physical decline, and this atmosphere contributed heavily to the emotional weight carried by the block itself, and as one reflects on the broader implications, it becomes evident that Block 10 functioned through systems of institutional order that transformed medical environments into instruments of confinement and experimentation, where procedures associated outwardly with science and medicine existed entirely within structures of coercion, surveillance, and ideological control, and this contradiction shaped every aspect of life inside the building, and as this develops further, the role of observation becomes increasingly central, where prisoners learned to interpret subtle changes in guard behavior, doctor movements, schedules, and conversations in order to anticipate examinations or procedures, and this constant attention to the surrounding environment became part of survival inside the block itself, reflecting broader patterns of awareness necessary throughout Auschwitz. And as we consider the perspective of women living inside Block 10 over long periods, it becomes clear that the building carried an atmosphere of suspended existence, where ordinary camp labor routines were replaced by confinement, waiting, and continuous uncertainty regarding what would happen next, and this uncertainty shaped memory of the block long after liberation, and as this develops, the connection between routine, fear, and medical authority becomes increasingly interconnected, where each element reinforced the others in shaping daily life inside Block 10. And thus, the routines of the building can be understood as systems through which confinement, experimentation, and psychological pressure became woven into the ordinary structure of daily existence within one of Auschwitz's most secretive medical spaces. As daily life inside Block 10 continued through repeated cycles of examinations, waiting, and restricted movement, the emotional atmosphere of the building became increasingly shaped by uncertainty and the constant awareness of institutional control, and it becomes evident that ordinary routines inside the block carried psychological meaning far beyond their surface appearance, because every inspection, medical round, or movement through the corridors existed within an environment where prisoners understood that procedures and decisions affecting their bodies and futures remained entirely outside their control, and as this develops, the relationship between confinement and time becomes increasingly significant, where days inside Block 10 often appeared repetitive and slow while simultaneously filled with tension regarding unexpected examinations, transfers, or interventions by medical personnel, and this altered perception of time shaped how prisoners experienced the environment around them, and as one reflects on the internal atmosphere of the sleeping quarters, it becomes clear that the crowded rooms inside the block carried a subdued sense of collective exhaustion, where women recovering from procedures or suffering from illness rested within confined spaces marked by quiet conversation, physical weakness, limited privacy, and continuous awareness of others enduring similar uncertainty, and this shared environment shaped emotional relationships inside the building by creating forms of mutual observation and awareness among prisoners themselves, and as this develops further, the role of medical authority becomes increasingly apparent, where doctors and officials moved through the block carrying enormous power over the routines, examinations, and physical conditions shaping daily life, and this imbalance of authority reinforced the psychological atmosphere of helplessness surrounding many prisoners inside Block 10, where medical procedures no longer appeared connected to healing alone but instead to systems of institutional experimentation and administrative control, and as we consider the sensory aspects of the building, it becomes evident that Block 10 existed within an atmosphere of restrained movement and constant anticipation, where footsteps approaching corridors, opening doors, medical instruments, distant voices, and the sudden arrival of guards or doctors could transform ordinary moments into periods of intense fear and uncertainty, and this sensory tension contributed strongly to the emotional memory associated with the block, and as this develops, the relationship between secrecy and daily routine becomes increasingly interconnected, where much of life inside Block 10 unfolded behind closed doors and restricted access, reinforcing the sense that the building functioned according to hidden purposes separate from ordinary camp structures, and this secrecy shaped how prisoners understood their own confinement by surrounding daily routines with unanswered questions and limited knowledge regarding the broader operation of the block, and as one reflects on the broader implications, it becomes evident that Block 10 demonstrated how medical institutions could be transformed into spaces of coercion under authoritarian systems, where scientific language, examinations, and procedures existed within structures built entirely upon imprisonment and ideological control, and this transformation altered the meaning of medical space itself by merging treatment, observation, and experimentation into one system of institutional authority, and as this develops further, the role of prisoner interactions becomes increasingly central, where women inside the block exchanged observations, supported one another emotionally when possible, and attempted to interpret the routines surrounding them through collective awareness of changes in atmosphere and procedure, and these interactions shaped the emotional structure of daily life despite the fear and isolation surrounding the building, and as we consider the perspective of those confined within Block 10. For extended periods, it becomes clear that the building existed as an environment defined not only by physical suffering but by prolonged psychological strain created through uncertainty, restricted autonomy, and constant anticipation of medical intervention, and this atmosphere contributed heavily to later recollections of the block as one of the most emotionally oppressive spaces within Auschwitz, and as this develops, the connection between routine, secrecy, and psychological exhaustion becomes increasingly interconnected, where each element reinforced the others in shaping daily existence inside the building, and thus life inside Block 10 can be understood as a carefully controlled system where ordinary routines became inseparable from fear, observation, and the constant awareness that medicine itself had been transformed into part of the structure of confinement and experimentation inside Auschwitz. Chapter 1, Segment 3. The Doctors, the Procedures, and the System of Control. As one considers the operation of Auschwitz Block 10 beyond the daily routines experienced by imprisoned women, the role of the doctors and medical authorities connected to the building emerges as one of the most defining aspects shaping its atmosphere and purpose, and it becomes evident that Block 10 functioned through a system in which medical authority, institutional hierarchy, and ideological objectives became deeply interconnected, where examinations, procedures, and administrative decisions unfolded inside a structure governed entirely through coercion and absolute imbalance of power, and as this develops, the relationship between medicine and control becomes increasingly central to understanding the block itself, where the language and appearance of medical practice existed within an environment where prisoners possessed no meaningful ability to refuse procedures or determine their own physical fate, and this reality transformed the building into one of the clearest examples of how scientific authority was distorted inside the concentration camp system, and as one reflects on the physical presence of doctors inside Block 10, it becomes clear that their movement through corridors, examination rooms, and wards shaped the emotional atmosphere of the building continuously, where the arrival of medical personnel often brought tension, fear, and uncertainty among prisoners who understood that examinations could lead to painful procedures, additional interventions, or worsening physical condition, and this awareness shaped daily life inside the block itself. And as this develops further, the role of routine medical examinations becomes increasingly significant, where inspections and procedures were carried out according to organized schedules tied to experimental objectives rather than ordinary therapeutic care, and these repeated interventions created an atmosphere in which the body itself became subject to constant institutional observation and manipulation, reinforcing the broader structures of control governing Auschwitz as a whole. And as we consider the sensory aspects of the medical environment inside Block 10, it becomes evident that the building carried a distinct atmosphere shaped by enclosed examination rooms, footsteps moving through narrow hallways, opening doors, quiet instructions, medical instruments, whispered conversations between prisoners, and long periods of tense silence before procedures. And this sensory environment reinforced awareness that ordinary routines inside the block were inseparable from fear and uncertainty regarding what medical intervention might come next. And as this develops, the relationship between scientific procedure and ideological policy becomes increasingly apparent, where many of the experiments conducted inside Block 10 were connected directly to Nazi racial theories and broader goals concerning sterilization and population control, and this ideological framework shaped the objectives of the procedures themselves by turning imprisoned women into subjects within a system that treated human bodies as instruments of experimentation rather than individuals possessing dignity or autonomy. And as one reflects on the broader implications, it becomes evident that Block 10 represented not only a site of medical abuse but also a demonstration of how professional authority and institutional structures can become integrated into systems of oppression when ethical boundaries collapse under authoritarian ideology, and this realization remains central to historical understanding of the building and its role within Auschwitz. And as this develops further, the role of prisoner medical workers becomes increasingly interconnected with the daily operation of the block, where inmate nurses and assistants often existed within deeply difficult circumstances, attempting to navigate systems of authority while interacting directly with women subjected to examinations and procedures, and these relationships shaped much of the human atmosphere inside the building. Despite the overwhelming conditions imposed by the camp administration, and as we consider the perspective of imprisoned women living under this system, it becomes clear that the presence of doctors and medical procedures shaped nearly every aspect of psychological existence inside Block 10, where ordinary routines unfolded beneath constant awareness that institutional authority extended directly into the body itself, and this awareness contributed heavily to the atmosphere of fear and emotional exhaustion defining life inside the block. And as this develops, the connection between medical authority, institutional routine, and coercive control becomes increasingly interconnected, where each element reinforced the others in shaping the operation of Block 10, and thus the doctors and procedures associated with the building can be understood as part of a broader system in which science, administration, and ideological power merged together. Within one of the most disturbing experimental environments inside Auschwitz, as the routines of examinations and procedures continued inside Block 10, the building increasingly functioned as a closed system where institutional authority shaped nearly every aspect of daily existence, and it becomes evident that the power exercised by doctors and camp officials extended far beyond individual medical interventions because the entire structure of the block operated according to principles of observation, regulation, and bodily control connected directly to the broader ideology of the Nazi camp system, and as this develops, the relationship between procedure and psychological pressure becomes increasingly significant, where prisoners inside Block 10 often lived in constant anticipation of examinations, selections, or operations, without fully understanding when they would occur or what their consequences would be, and this uncertainty transformed ordinary routines into experiences shaped continuously by fear and emotional strain, and as one reflects on the organization of the examination process inside the building, it becomes clear that procedures unfolded within highly controlled environments where movement, timing, and access to information remain tightly restricted, and this structure reinforced the imbalance of power defining Block 10 itself, where medical spaces that outwardly resembled clinical environments functioned entirely according to systems of coercion and institutional domination, and as this develops further, the role of confinement becomes increasingly apparent, where women subjected to experiments remained physically isolated within the block and psychologically separated from ordinary expectations of medical treatment or recovery, and this isolation intensified the emotional atmosphere inside the building by surrounding every procedure with uncertainty regarding both immediate suffering and long-term consequences. And as we consider the sensory aspects of these routines, it becomes evident that Block 10 carried a constant atmosphere of restrained tension shaped by approaching footsteps, movement of guards and doctors through corridors, sounds of medical preparation, opening doors, leading into examination rooms, whispered communication among prisoners, and long silences following procedures, and this sensory environment reinforced the perception that the building operated according to hidden schedules and institutional decisions beyond the control of those imprisoned within it, and as this develops, the relationship between science and dehumanization becomes increasingly interconnected, where the procedures carried out inside Block 10 reflected an ideological system that reduced prisoners to objects of experimentation rather than human beings possessing autonomy and dignity, and this transformation of medical authority into an Instrument of domination remains one of the defining historical meanings associated with the building itself, and as one reflects on the broader implications, it becomes evident that Block 10 demonstrated how professional structures associated with medicine and research could become deeply corrupted within authoritarian systems when ethical responsibility was replaced by ideological obedience and institutional power, and this historical lesson extends far beyond Auschwitz alone by revealing the dangers created when science operates without moral limits or respect for human rights, and as this develops further, the role of emotional survival among prisoners becomes increasingly central, where women inside the block attempted to navigate the environment through observation, mutual awareness, quiet support, and careful attention to routines surrounding procedures and examinations, and these small forms of human connection shaped the psychological landscape of Block 10 despite the overwhelming systems of control surrounding daily life inside it, and as we consider the perspective of those who endured prolonged confinement within the building, it becomes clear that the atmosphere of Block 10 was defined not only by physical suffering but by the continuous awareness that medical authority itself had become inseparable from fear, coercion, and institutional experimentation, and this awareness contributed heavily to later memories of the block as one of the most psychologically oppressive environments inside Auschwitz, and as this develops, the connection between medical routine, institutional power, and psychological uncertainty becomes increasingly interconnected, where each element reinforced the others in shaping the experience of life inside the building, and thus the system of doctors, procedures, and control operating within Block 10 can be understood as a structure where science, ideology, and confinement merge together to create one of the most disturbing examples of medical abuse within the Nazi concentration camp system. Chapter 2, Segment 1. The Women Imprisoned Inside Block 10. As one considers the daily reality of Auschwitz Block 10 beyond the procedures and institutional structure surrounding it, attention gradually turns toward the women imprisoned inside the building itself, and it becomes evident that the atmosphere of Block 10 was shaped not only by medical authority and experimental routines but by the presence of individuals forced to exist within an environment defined by uncertainty, confinement, and constant observation, and as this develops, the relationship between identity and survival becomes increasingly central to understanding life inside the block, where women from different regions, languages, backgrounds, and experiences were brought together within a highly controlled medical environment that reduced them to subjects inside an institutional system of experimentation, and this transformation shaped both the psychological atmosphere of the building and the daily interactions unfolding within it, and as one reflects on the arrival of women into Block 10, it becomes clear that many entered already weakened by the broader conditions of Auschwitz itself, where overcrowding, forced labor, disease, hunger, transport conditions, and physical exhaustion had already shaped their bodies and emotional state long before they crossed the doors of the building, and these conditions intensified the atmosphere inside the block by surrounding daily routines with visible signs of physical suffering and vulnerability, and as this develops further, the role of uncertainty becomes increasingly significant, where prisoners inside Block 10 often possessed little knowledge regarding why they had been selected, what procedures they would undergo, or how long they would remain confined within the building, and this absence of clear information shaped the emotional environment continuously by surrounding ordinary routines with fear and anticipation, and as we consider the sensory aspects of daily life among the women inside the block, it becomes evident that the atmosphere carried a distinct mixture of silence, exhaustion, quiet interaction, and restrained emotional tension, where whispered conversations, movement between bunks, footsteps of guards and medical personnel, sounds from nearby corridors, and long periods of waiting shaped the rhythm of existence inside the wards, and this sensory environment reinforced awareness that daily life unfolded beneath constant supervision and institutional control, and as this develops, the relationship between collective experience and isolation becomes increasingly apparent, where women shared confined spaces and similar fears, while simultaneously enduring deeply personal uncertainty regarding their bodies, procedures, and futures, and this combination of collective confinement and psychological isolation shaped the emotional structure of Block 10 itself, and as one reflects on the broader implications, it becomes evident that the women imprisoned inside the building existed within a system that attempted to strip away individuality through registration, examination, routine, and institutional authority, and yet forms of awareness, memory, and emotional connection persisted within the confined environment despite these conditions, and this persistence remains central to understanding the human reality inside Block 10 beyond its role as a site of experimentation alone, and as this develops further, the role of observation becomes increasingly central, where prisoners learned to interpret the atmosphere of the block through changes in doctor behavior, movement through corridors, scheduling of examinations, and the visible condition of other women returning from procedures, and this careful attention to the surrounding environment became part of survival inside the building itself, reflecting broader patterns of awareness necessary throughout Auschwitz, and as we consider the perspective of women living within Block 10 over extended periods, it becomes clear that daily existence unfolded within a fragile balance between fear, endurance, observation, and emotional exhaustion, where ordinary routines were shaped continuously by institutional power operating directly upon the body, and this atmosphere contributed heavily to later recollections of the building as one of the most psychologically oppressive environments inside the camp, and as this develops, the connection between confinement, uncertainty, and collective survival becomes increasingly interconnected, where each element reinforced the others in shaping life inside Block 10, and thus the women imprisoned within the building can be understood not merely as subjects within medical procedures but as individuals navigating an environment of secrecy, fear, and institutional control, while attempting to preserve awareness and emotional endurance inside one of Auschwitz's most isolated spaces. As women continued living inside Block 10 through repeated cycles of examinations, confinement, and waiting, the emotional atmosphere of the building increasingly became shaped by the relationships and shared awareness developing among prisoners themselves, and it becomes evident that although the block functioned through systems designed to isolate, control, and objectify those inside it, forms of observation, mutual understanding, and quiet support still emerged within the confined environment, and as this develops, the relationship between collective experience and emotional survival becomes increasingly significant, where women living inside the same wards observed one another's condition, interpreted routines together, exchanged fragments of information, and quietly recognized the fear and uncertainty shaping daily life around them, and these interactions contributed to the human atmosphere of Block 10. Despite the oppressive institutional structure surrounding it, and as one reflects on the physical conditions inside the rooms and wards, it becomes clear that overcrowding, weakness, limited privacy, and physical suffering created an environment where prisoners remained constantly aware of one another's emotional and bodily condition, and this closeness shaped the atmosphere of the building by making suffering highly visible within everyday existence, and as this develops further, the role of waiting becomes increasingly apparent, where long stretches of inactivity between examinations or procedures created periods in which time seemed suspended inside the block, and this waiting intensified psychological tension because ordinary daily routines remained overshadowed by uncertainty regarding what would happen next. And as we consider the sensory aspects of these periods, it becomes evident that silence carried enormous emotional weight inside Block 10, where quiet movement through corridors, low voices between prisoners, sounds from examination areas, footsteps approaching doors, and prolonged stillness shaped the atmosphere continuously, and this sensory environment reinforced the feeling that fear and anticipation had become woven into the ordinary rhythm of life inside the building itself. And as this develops, the relationship between physical suffering and emotional awareness becomes increasingly interconnected, where many women endured pain, exhaustion, infection, or lasting physical effects connected to the procedures carried out inside the block, and these conditions shaped interactions between prisoners by surrounding daily life with visible signs of bodily vulnerability and uncertainty, and this atmosphere contributed heavily to the emotional intensity associated with memory of Block 10 after the war, and as one reflects on the broader implications, it becomes evident that the women imprisoned inside the building existed within an environment where institutional systems attempted to reduce them to experimental subjects while simultaneously stripping away autonomy, privacy, and certainty regarding the future, and yet, within these conditions, prisoners still observed, remembered, interpreted, and emotionally responded to the world surrounding them, and this persistence of awareness remains central to understanding the lived reality inside Block 10 itself, and as this develops further, the role of fear becomes increasingly central, where anticipation of examinations, procedures, selections, or interactions with doctors shaped nearly every aspect of daily existence inside the building, and this constant emotional pressure transformed ordinary routines into experiences saturated with psychological tension and uncertainty, and as we consider the perspective of women enduring prolonged confinement inside Block 10, it becomes clear that survival involved not only physical endurance but continuous emotional adaptation to an environment where medicine, secrecy, and institutional power operated together through systems of observation and control, and this atmosphere shaped memory of the block as a place where fear became part of ordinary daily routine, and as this develops, the connection between collective confinement, emotional strain, and institutional authority becomes increasingly interconnected, where each element reinforced the others in shaping the psychological environment of Block 10, and thus the women imprisoned inside the building can be understood as individuals forced to navigate one of the most isolated and emotionally oppressive environments within Auschwitz while enduring systems of experimentation and control that transformed everyday existence into a continuous struggle, shaped by uncertainty, observation, and survival. Chapter 2, Segment 2. Sterilization experiments and the use of medical power. As one considers the specific experiments carried out inside Auschwitz Block 10, the sterilization procedures imposed upon imprisoned women emerge as one of the central aspects defining the historical meaning of the building, and it becomes evident that these experiments existed within a broader ideological framework shaped by Nazi racial policy, population control theories, and the misuse of medical authority under authoritarian rule, and as this develops, the relationship between science and institutional power becomes increasingly central to understanding the environment inside Block 10, where medical procedures associated outwardly with research and treatment were transformed into tools of coercion carried out upon prisoners who possessed no ability to refuse or meaningfully understand what was being done to them, and this reality shaped both the physical and psychological atmosphere surrounding the experiments themselves, and as one reflects on the goals connected to sterilization research during the Nazi period, it becomes clear that officials and doctors sought methods they believed could be applied rapidly and systematically according to racial ideology and broader population policies, and this pursuit of efficiency and control shaped the experimental procedures carried out inside Block 10 by reducing imprisoned women to subjects within a system focused not upon healing but upon manipulation of the body for ideological purposes, and as this develops further, the role of medical authority becomes increasingly significant, where doctors inside the block operated with enormous institutional power over prisoners whose lives and physical condition remained entirely dependent upon decisions made within the camp administration, and this imbalance transformed examinations and procedures into instruments of domination rather than ordinary medical practice, and as we consider the sensory aspects of the environment surrounding these experiments, it becomes evident that Block 10 carried an atmosphere of restrained fear and uncertainty shaped by medical preparation, movement through corridors, examination rooms, instruments, whispered communication among prisoners, footsteps of doctors and guards, and long periods of waiting before procedures, and this sensory environment reinforced awareness that the building functioned according to hidden schedules and institutional decisions beyond the control of those confined inside it, and as this develops, the relationship between procedure and suffering becomes increasingly apparent, where many women subjected to sterilization experiments endured severe physical pain, infections, weakness, lasting injuries, and emotional trauma connected directly to the interventions performed within the building, and these consequences shaped daily life inside the block by surrounding ordinary routines with visible evidence of physical decline and vulnerability, and as one reflects on the broader implications, it becomes evident that the sterilization experiments conducted in Block 10 represented a profound corruption of medical ethics and scientific responsibility, where professional knowledge and institutional authority were directed toward systems of coercion and bodily control under ideological justification, and this transformation remains one of the defining historical lessons associated with the building and the wider Nazi medical system, and as this develops further, the role of secrecy becomes increasingly interconnected with the operation of the experiments themselves, where restricted access, controlled movement, and limited information preserved the isolated atmosphere surrounding Block 10 and reinforced the psychological uncertainty experienced by prisoners inside it, and this secrecy shaped both the emotional environment of the building and later understanding of the experiments conducted there, and as we consider the perspective of women subjected to these procedures, it becomes clear that the atmosphere of Block 10 was defined not only by physical suffering but by continuous awareness that medical authority itself had become inseparable from fear, coercion, and institutional control, and this realization shaped memory of the block long after liberation, and as this develops, the connection between ideology, medical experimentation, and psychological domination becomes increasingly interconnected, where each element reinforced the others in shaping the operation of Block 10. And thus, the sterilization experiments conducted inside the building can be understood as part of a broader system in which science, institutional power, and racial ideology merged together to create one of the most disturbing forms of medical abuse within Auschwitz. As the sterilization experiments inside Block 10 continued over time, the routines surrounding these procedures increasingly shaped the emotional and psychological structure of daily life within the building, and it becomes evident that fear inside the block often developed not only through the procedures themselves but through the constant anticipation surrounding examinations, selections, and medical intervention, where prisoners lived with continuous uncertainty regarding when they might next be called into examination rooms or subjected to additional operations and treatments, and as this develops, the relationship between anticipation and institutional control becomes increasingly significant, where the power exercised by doctors and camp authorities extended deeply into the psychological atmosphere of the block by transforming ordinary routines into periods overshadowed by fear of what might happen next. And this uncertainty shaped nearly every aspect of daily existence inside the building, and as one reflects on the physical environment surrounding the procedures, it becomes clear that examination rooms, corridors, wards, and waiting areas carried a constant atmosphere of emotional tension, where women moved through tightly controlled spaces beneath supervision, while observing the condition of others returning from experiments, and this visible awareness of suffering contributed heavily to the atmosphere of fear surrounding Block 10 itself, and as this develops further, the role of silence becomes increasingly apparent, where quiet conversations between prisoners, subdued movement through hallways, footsteps approaching doors, and long stretches of waiting created an environment in which emotional strain remained present even during seemingly ordinary moments of daily routine, and this silence carried psychological weight because it existed within a setting where medical authority had become associated with pain, uncertainty, and institutional power rather than recovery or care. And as we consider the sensory aspects of the block during this period, it becomes evident that sounds connected to medical procedure and supervision shaped the emotional rhythm of life inside the building, where opening doors, movement of equipment, distant instructions, footsteps of guards and doctors, and the atmosphere surrounding examination areas reinforced awareness that the body itself had become the focus of continuous institutional intervention, and this sensory environment contributed strongly to later recollections of Block 10 as one of the most psychologically oppressive locations within Auschwitz, and as this develops, the relationship between ideology and dehumanization becomes increasingly interconnected, where the sterilization experiments reflected broader Nazi policies that viewed certain populations through racial categories and biological theories rather than as individuals possessing rights and dignity, and this ideological framework allowed doctors and administrators to justify procedures that ignored consent, suffering, and the humanity of those imprisoned inside the block, and as one reflects on the broader implications, it becomes evident that Block 10 demonstrated how professional authority and scientific language can become deeply dangerous when separated from ethical responsibility and placed within authoritarian systems that reward obedience to ideology above human life. And this lesson remains central to the historical significance of the building and the study of medical ethics after the Second World War, and as this develops further, the role of emotional endurance among prisoners becomes increasingly central, where women inside Block 10 attempted to survive psychologically through observation, quiet support, awareness of routines, and shared recognition of the fear surrounding them, and these forms of human connection persisted even within an environment specifically designed to isolate and control. And as we consider the perspective of those who endured repeated procedures and prolonged confinement inside the block, it becomes clear that life within Block 10 unfolded through continuous interaction between physical suffering and psychological uncertainty, where medical experimentation shaped not only the body but the emotional structure of daily existence itself, and this atmosphere contributed heavily to later testimony describing the block as a place where medicine and fear became inseparable, and as this develops, the connection between institutional authority, experimental routine, and emotional oppression becomes increasingly interconnected, where each element reinforced the others in shaping the experience of imprisoned women inside Block 10, and thus, the sterilization experiments carried out within the building can be understood not only as acts of physical abuse but as components of a larger system of ideological and psychological domination, operating through the misuse of medical power inside Auschwitz. Chapter 2, Segment 3. Isolation, Observation, and Psychological Survival inside Block 10. As one considers the emotional atmosphere inside Auschwitz Block 10 beyond the physical suffering and medical procedures carried out there, the experience of isolation emerges as one of the defining psychological realities shaping daily existence within the building, and it becomes evident that confinement inside Block 10 operated not only through locked rooms, restricted movement, and institutional authority but also through the creation of an environment where uncertainty, secrecy, and constant observation gradually reshaped how prisoners understood themselves and the world surrounding them, and as this develops, the relationship between isolation and psychological survival becomes increasingly central to understanding life inside the block, where women imprisoned there existed within a medical environment separated physically and emotionally from ordinary structures of camp life while simultaneously remaining trapped inside the larger systems of Auschwitz itself, and this dual condition shaped the atmosphere of the building continuously, and as one reflects on the physical layout of Block 10, it becomes clear that the structure reinforced emotional separation through enclosed rooms, narrow corridors, restricted access, and controlled movement between wards and examination areas, and this organization created an atmosphere where prisoners rarely experienced privacy or freedom while still feeling deeply isolated within the institutional structure surrounding them, and as this develops further, the role of secrecy becomes increasingly significant, where many women inside the block possessed only fragmented understanding of the experiments being conducted, the intentions of the doctors, or the future awaiting them inside the building, and this absence of clear information intensified psychological strain by surrounding daily routine with unanswered questions and fear of what might happen next. And as we consider the sensory aspects of life inside the block, it becomes evident that silence carried enormous emotional weight within the confined environment, where footsteps in corridors, opening doors, distant medical activity, whispered conversations between prisoners, and long periods of waiting created a subdued but tense atmosphere shaped by constant anticipation, and this sensory environment reinforced awareness that ordinary routines unfolded beneath systems of authority capable of intervening unpredictably at any moment, and as this develops, the relationship between observation and survival becomes increasingly apparent, where prisoners inside Block 10 learned to interpret subtle changes in doctor behavior, movement through hallways, scheduling of examinations, and the condition of women returning from procedures in order to understand the environment around them, and this careful attention to routine became part of emotional survival inside the building itself, reflecting broader patterns of awareness necessary throughout Auschwitz, and as one reflects on the broader implications, it becomes evident that the psychological environment of Block 10 represented one of the clearest examples of how authoritarian systems can extend control beyond physical confinement into emotional and mental existence, where uncertainty, surveillance, and institutional secrecy gradually shaped perception of time, routine, and the body itself, and this transformation contributed heavily to the oppressive atmosphere associated with the building after the war, and as this develops further, the role of collective confinement becomes increasingly interconnected with emotional isolation, where women lived together in overcrowded wards, observed one another's suffering, and shared the same fears while simultaneously enduring deeply personal anxiety regarding procedures, pain, and survival, and this combination of shared environment and internal uncertainty shaped the emotional structure of daily life inside Block 10. And as we consider the perspective of prisoners enduring prolonged confinement within the building, it becomes clear that survival involved far more than physical endurance alone, requiring continuous psychological adaptation to an environment governed by secrecy, observation, and institutional power, and this awareness shaped later testimony describing Block 10 as a place where fear became woven into ordinary routine itself, and as this develops, the connection between isolation, secrecy, and emotional survival becomes increasingly interconnected, where each element reinforced the others in shaping the atmosphere inside the block, and thus, Block 10 can be understood as an environment where psychological pressure operated continuously through confinement, uncertainty, and observation, creating one of the most emotionally oppressive spaces within Auschwitz. As women remained confined inside Block 10 through repeated cycles of examinations, waiting, and uncertainty, the psychological atmosphere of the building increasingly became shaped by the constant awareness that ordinary routines existed entirely under institutional control, and it becomes evident that emotional survival inside the block depended heavily upon the ability to adapt mentally to an environment where fear, anticipation, and restricted autonomy defined nearly every aspect of daily existence, and as this develops, the relationship between routine and psychological endurance becomes increasingly significant, where prisoners learn to navigate the atmosphere of the building through observation of schedules, movement patterns, medical rounds, and the behavior of doctors and guards, using familiarity with these routines as one of the few available forms of stability inside an otherwise unpredictable environment. And this dependence upon routine shaped the emotional structure of life inside Block 10 itself, and as one reflects on the emotional atmosphere within the wards, it becomes clear that waiting became one of the most psychologically difficult aspects of existence inside the building, where women often spent long periods confined to bunks or enclosed rooms without clear information regarding future procedures or outcomes, and this uncertainty transformed time itself into a source of emotional strain because ordinary days unfolded beneath constant anticipation of interruption, examination, or transfer, and as this develops further, the role of collective awareness becomes increasingly apparent, where prisoners quietly exchanged observations about the routines surrounding them, interpreted changes in atmosphere together, and attempted to understand the meaning of procedures and selections through shared experience, and these interactions created limited forms of emotional connection within an environment specifically designed to isolate and dominate. And as we consider the sensory aspects of psychological life inside the block, it becomes evident that the sounds and silences of Block 10 shaped emotional perception continuously, where footsteps approaching corridors, opening doors, movement of medical personnel, whispered communication between prisoners, and sudden interruptions of stillness carried immense psychological significance because they often signaled examinations or procedures connected to fear and uncertainty, and this sensory tension contributed heavily to the emotional memory associated with the building, and as this develops, the relationship between bodily control and psychological pressure becomes increasingly interconnected, where the experiments conducted inside Block 10 affected not only physical health but also prisoners' understanding of their own bodies and futures, and this loss of autonomy intensified emotional exhaustion by surrounding ordinary existence with awareness that institutional power extended directly into intimate aspects of bodily experience itself, and as one reflects on the broader implications, it becomes evident that Block 10 revealed how systems of medical experimentation under authoritarian rule can transform psychological existence as profoundly as physical conditions, where secrecy, institutional authority, and constant observation gradually reshape emotional perception and personal identity inside confined environments, and this realization remains central to historical understanding of the block and its operation within Auschwitz, and as this develops further, the role of memory becomes increasingly central, where survivors later described not only the physical pain connected to procedures but the atmosphere of fear, uncertainty, waiting, and emotional isolation that defined daily life inside the building, and these recollections preserve the psychological reality of Block 10 beyond its medical history alone, connecting memory directly to the lived experience of confinement and survival, and as we consider the perspective of women enduring prolonged imprisonment inside the block, it becomes clear that emotional endurance often depended upon maintaining awareness, interpreting routines, supporting others when possible, and preserving fragments of personal identity within an environment designed to reduce individuals to subjects of institutional control, and this persistence of psychological resistance shaped the human reality of Block 10 despite the overwhelming systems surrounding it, and as this develops, the connection between observation, emotional endurance, and institutional domination becomes increasingly interconnected, where each element reinforced the others in shaping daily existence inside the building, and thus the psychological environment of Block 10 can be understood as a system where fear, secrecy, routine, and confinement operated together continuously, transforming ordinary daily life into a prolonged struggle for emotional survival within one of the most secretive experimental spaces. Inside Auschwitz. Chapter 3, Segment 1. The prisoner nurses and medical assistants inside Block 10. As one considers the operation of Auschwitz Block 10 beyond the authority of the Nazi doctors and administrators who controlled the building, attention gradually turns toward the prisoner nurses, assistants, and inmate medical workers who existed within the same confined environment, and it becomes evident that these individuals occupied deeply difficult and morally complex positions inside the block, where they lived under the same systems of confinement and fear as the women around them, while simultaneously being required to assist within routines connected to examinations, procedures, and daily medical organization, and as this develops, the relationship between survival and institutional structure becomes increasingly central to understanding the role of prisoner medical staff inside Block 10, where ordinary concepts of medical care and professional duty were distorted by the reality of the concentration camp system itself, and this contradiction shaped nearly every aspect of daily life for those working inside the building, and as one reflects on the physical routines carried out by prisoner nurses and assistants, it becomes clear that much of their daily existence unfolded through repetitive tasks connected to cleaning wards, preparing rooms, moving prisoners, distributing limited supplies, assisting during examinations, and observing the condition of women recovering from procedures, and these Routines placed them in continuous proximity to both suffering and institutional authority, reinforcing the emotionally exhausting atmosphere surrounding Block 10 itself. And as this develops further, the role of observation becomes increasingly significant, where prisoner medical workers learned to interpret changes in the atmosphere of the building through the behavior of doctors, scheduling of examinations, movement through corridors, and visible condition of prisoners following procedures, and this awareness shaped their ability to navigate the environment while attempting to preserve fragments of humanity within a system organized around control and experimentation. And as we consider the sensory aspects of the medical wards, it becomes evident that the atmosphere surrounding prisoner nurses and assistants was defined by constant movement through enclosed spaces filled with tension, where footsteps echoed across corridors, quiet instructions passed between workers, medical instruments were prepared within examination rooms, and the sounds of weakened prisoners recovering inside crowded wards blended into a subdued but emotionally heavy rhythm shaping daily life inside the building. And this sensory environment reinforced awareness that even ordinary tasks unfolded beneath systems of surveillance and fear, and as this develops, the relationship between care and coercion becomes increasingly apparent, where prisoner nurses often attempted to provide emotional reassurance, physical assistance, or quiet support to women suffering inside the block while simultaneously operating within institutional structures that allowed almost no meaningful autonomy or protection, and this contradiction shaped the emotional complexity of their role by placing acts of human compassion inside a setting fundamentally defined by violence and control, and as one reflects on the broader implications, it becomes evident that the presence of prisoner medical workers inside Block 10 revealed how the camp system depended not only upon direct authority from guards and doctors but also upon structures that forced prisoners themselves into administrative and operational roles within the machinery of confinement, and this reality created environments filled with moral ambiguity, emotional strain, and constant psychological pressure. And as this develops further, the role of emotional endurance becomes increasingly interconnected with routine itself, where prisoner nurses survived by adapting to repeated exposure to suffering, fear, examinations, and uncertainty while still attempting to maintain awareness of the humanity of those around them, and this persistence shaped the emotional atmosphere inside the wards even within the severe limitations imposed by the camp system. And as we consider the perspective of women imprisoned inside Block 10, it becomes clear that interactions with prisoner nurses and assistants often carried enormous emotional significance because these relationships represented some of the few moments of human connection available within an environment otherwise dominated by institutional authority and secrecy, and this dynamic contributed strongly to the lived reality of daily life inside the building, and as this develops, the connection between medical routine, emotional survival, and institutional coercion becomes increasingly interconnected, where each element reinforced the others in shaping the operation of Block 10, and thus the prisoner nurses and assistants working inside the building can be understood as individuals forced to navigate one of the most psychologically difficult roles within Auschwitz, attempting to preserve fragments of care and human awareness inside an environment controlled entirely through fear, experimentation, and institutional power. As prisoner nurses and medical assistants continued carrying out their routines inside Block 10, the emotional and psychological pressures associated with their role became increasingly inseparable from the atmosphere of the building itself, and it becomes evident that these women existed within a constant tension between institutional obligation and human response, where daily survival required participation in the routines of the block while emotional awareness exposed them continuously to the suffering, fear, and uncertainty experienced by those surrounding them, and as this develops, the relationship between routine and emotional adaptation becomes increasingly significant, where repeated exposure to examinations, procedures, physical pain, and psychological distress gradually shaped how prisoner medical workers understood their own position inside the system operating within Block 10, and this awareness created an environment in which ordinary tasks carried profound emotional weight, and as one reflects on the physical environment surrounding these routines, it becomes clear that the confined wards and corridors of the building intensified emotional pressure by forcing prisoner nurses to move constantly between spaces associated with waiting, recovery, examination, and fear, and this movement exposed them continuously to the emotional atmosphere shaping the block while leaving little opportunity for distance from the suffering unfolding around them. And as this develops further, the role of silence becomes increasingly apparent, where quiet interactions between nurses and prisoners, subdued communication during medical preparation, footsteps in corridors, and long periods of waiting created an environment where emotional tension often remained unspoken yet deeply present within daily routine, and this silence shaped the atmosphere of Block 10 by reinforcing the sense that fear and uncertainty existed beneath nearly every interaction inside the building, and as we consider the sensory aspects of this environment, it becomes evident that the ordinary sounds of medical routine carried psychological significance. Inside the block, where opening doors, movement of instruments, whispered instructions, footsteps of doctors approaching examination areas, and the weakened voices of prisoners recovering from procedures shaped the emotional rhythm of daily existence for both prisoners and medical assistants alike, and this sensory environment contributed heavily to the oppressive atmosphere later described in survivor testimony connected to Block 10, and as this develops, the relationship between emotional survival and small acts of humanity becomes increasingly interconnected, where prisoner nurses sometimes attempted to comfort weakened women, provide fragments of information, assist physically after procedures, or preserve moments of dignity within an environment specifically designed to deny autonomy and emotional security. And these limited acts carried enormous meaning precisely because they existed inside a structure governed overwhelmingly through fear and institutional control, and as one reflects on the broader implications, it becomes evident that the role of prisoner medical workers inside Block 10 demonstrated how concentration camp systems forced individuals into morally impossible situations where survival, obedience, emotional endurance, and human compassion became entangled within structures of coercion and violence, and this complexity remains essential to historical understanding of the building and the lived experiences unfolding inside it, and as this develops further, the role of observation becomes increasingly central, where prisoner nurses relied upon careful awareness of doctor behavior, administrative changes, examination schedules, and the emotional condition of prisoners in order to navigate the environment surrounding them, and this dependence upon observation shaped their survival while simultaneously reinforcing the atmosphere of tension defining daily life inside the block. And as we consider the perspective of those imprisoned within Block 10, it becomes clear that prisoner nurses and assistants often represented fragile points of emotional connection within a world otherwise dominated by secrecy, fear, and institutional authority, and this perception shaped the memory of relationships formed inside the building despite the overwhelming conditions surrounding them, and as this develops, the connection between emotional endurance, institutional routine, and human response becomes increasingly interconnected, where each element reinforced the others in shaping the psychological environment of Block 10, and thus the prisoner nurses and medical assistants inside the building can be understood as individuals forced to exist between systems of coercion and acts of human awareness, attempting to navigate an environment where medical routine, fear, and survival became inseparable parts of daily existence within one of Auschwitz's most secretive experimental blocks. Chapter 3, Segment 2. Fear, Selections, and the Constant Atmosphere of Uncertainty. As one considers the psychological environment inside Auschwitz Block 10 beyond the visible routines of examinations and confinement, the constant atmosphere of fear emerges as one of the defining realities shaping daily existence within the building, and it becomes evident that this fear did not arise only from individual procedures or moments of direct intervention but from the continuous uncertainty surrounding life inside the block itself, where prisoners lived beneath systems of observation, institutional secrecy, and unpredictable medical authority that transformed ordinary routines into experiences filled with anticipation and emotional strain, and as this develops, the relationship between uncertainty and control becomes increasingly central to understanding the atmosphere inside Block 10, where women imprisoned there rarely possessed reliable information regarding future procedures, transfers, examinations, or selections, and this absence of certainty allowed institutional power to extend deeply into psychological existence itself, shaping how prisoners perceive time, routine, and their own physical condition, and as one reflects on the daily structure of the building, it becomes clear that fear became woven directly into ordinary movement and routine, where footsteps approaching corridors, opening doors, calls for examinations, movement of guards and doctors through wards, and changes in administrative behavior all carried emotional significance because they might signal painful procedures or new interventions, and this constant anticipation shaped the emotional rhythm of life inside the block. And as this develops further, the role of selections becomes increasingly significant, where women inside Block 10 understood that decisions regarding transfers, medical procedures, continued confinement, or removal from the building could occur suddenly and without explanation, and this unpredictability intensified the atmosphere of emotional instability surrounding daily existence inside the wards, and as we consider the sensory aspects of the environment, it becomes evident that Block 10 carried a subdued but continuously tense atmosphere shaped by silence, restrained movement, whispered communication between prisoners, footsteps echoing through enclosed corridors, and sudden interruptions caused by medical inspections or administrative activity, and this sensory environment reinforced awareness that fear existed not only during procedures themselves but continuously within the structure of ordinary life inside the building. And as this develops, the relationship between observation and survival becomes increasingly apparent, where prisoners relied heavily upon careful attention to routines, doctor behavior, schedules, and subtle changes in atmosphere in order to interpret what might happen next, and this dependence upon observation reflected broader patterns of psychological adaptation necessary throughout Auschwitz while becoming especially intense inside Block 10 due to the secrecy surrounding the experiments and procedures conducted there, and as one reflects on the broader implications, it becomes evident that the emotional environment of Block 10 functioned through systems of uncertainty that extended institutional authority beyond physical confinement, into the psychological structure of everyday existence, where unpredictability itself became part of the mechanism of control operating inside the building, and this realization remains central to understanding why survivors later described the block not only as a place of physical suffering, but as an environment of continuous emotional oppression, and as this develops further, the role of collective awareness becomes increasingly interconnected with fear itself, where prisoners observed the condition of women returning from examinations, noticed disappearances from the wards, and interpreted changes in atmosphere together while still enduring deeply personal anxiety regarding their own future inside the block, and this combination of shared observation and individual fear shaped the emotional structure of life inside the building. And as we consider the perspective of women enduring prolonged confinement inside Block 10, it becomes clear that psychological survival required constant adaptation to an environment where uncertainty had become ordinary and fear existed beneath even the most repetitive daily routines. And this awareness shaped memory of the block long after liberation, and as this develops, the connection between selections, secrecy, and emotional domination becomes increasingly interconnected, where each element reinforced the others in shaping the atmosphere inside Block 10, and thus the building can be understood as a space where institutional uncertainty itself became one of the most powerful instruments of psychological control within Auschwitz. As daily life inside Block 10 continued beneath the constant shadow of examinations, procedures, and administrative decisions, the emotional atmosphere of the building increasingly became defined by anticipation and psychological exhaustion, and it becomes evident that uncertainty inside the block functioned not as an occasional condition but as a permanent structure shaping how prisoners experienced nearly every aspect of daily existence, where ordinary routines unfolded beneath continuous awareness that institutional authority could intervene at any moment, through selections, transfers, or medical procedures beyond the control of those imprisoned there. And as this develops, the relationship between anticipation and emotional survival becomes increasingly significant, where women inside the block attempted to navigate the environment through observation, interpretation of routines, and emotional adaptation to a system designed to keep them uncertain about their own future, and this constant adjustment shaped the psychological rhythm of life inside the building itself. And as one reflects on the physical environment of the wards and corridors, it becomes clear that the enclosed structure of Block 10 intensified the emotional pressure surrounding daily routine, where narrow hallways restricted movement, closed doors, examination rooms, and crowded sleeping areas created an atmosphere in which prisoners remained constantly aware of institutional presence and limited autonomy. And this environment reinforced the sense that every section of the building operated according to hidden schedules and decisions controlled entirely by medical and camp authorities. And as this develops further, the role of silence becomes increasingly apparent, where long periods of waiting inside wards often unfolded in near quietness, interrupted only by footsteps, opening doors, whispered communication, movement of guards, or calls for examinations, and this silence carried enormous psychological significance because it heightened awareness of uncertainty and anticipation inside the confined environment. And as we consider the sensory aspects of the building, it becomes evident that even small sounds and movements acquired emotional meaning. Within Block 10, where approaching footsteps, distant conversations between doctors, preparation of examination rooms, or sudden activity in corridors could signal procedures or administrative actions connected to fear and suffering, and this sensory tension contributed strongly to the atmosphere of psychological instability later described by survivors, and as this develops, the relationship between institutional authority and emotional exhaustion becomes increasingly interconnected, where the unpredictability surrounding selections and medical intervention gradually eroded ordinary expectations of safety, stability, or control over the future, and this emotional exhaustion shaped daily existence by making uncertainty itself part of the lived structure of confinement inside the block, and as one reflects on the broader implications, it becomes evident that Block 10 demonstrated how authoritarian systems can use unpredictability and secrecy as mechanisms of domination, where fear is maintained not only through direct violence but through constant anticipation and restricted access to information, and this psychological structure transformed ordinary medical routine into part of a broader environment of emotional control, and as this develops further, the role of collective emotional awareness becomes increasingly central, where women inside the block observed one another's fear, physical condition, and emotional reactions while simultaneously struggling with their own uncertainty regarding future procedures or survival, and these shared experiences shaped the emotional atmosphere of the wards by creating forms of silent recognition among prisoners, enduring the same oppressive environment, and as we consider the perspective of those confined inside Block 10 for extended periods, it becomes clear that survival required continuous psychological endurance within a building where routine itself had become inseparable from fear and institutional power, and this reality contributed heavily to the memory of Block 10 as one of the most emotionally oppressive locations inside Auschwitz, and as this develops, the connection between fear, anticipation, and systems of institutional secrecy becomes increasingly interconnected, where each element reinforced the others in shaping daily life inside the block. And thus, the atmosphere of Block 10 can be understood as a carefully controlled environment, where uncertainty and emotional strain functioned continuously as part of the broader system of confinement, experimentation, and domination operating within Auschwitz. Chapter 3, Segment 3. The Hidden World Behind the Windows of Block 10. As one considers the broader atmosphere surrounding Auschwitz Block 10, the building increasingly appears as a hidden world existing within the already isolated environment of the camp itself, and it becomes evident that Block 10 operated through layers of secrecy and separation that distinguished it even from many other controlled sections of Auschwitz, where restricted access, covered windows, guarded corridors, and limited movement created an atmosphere in which much of what occurred inside remained concealed from ordinary prisoner life beyond the building, and as this develops, the relationship between secrecy and institutional power becomes increasingly central to understanding the role of Block 10 within Auschwitz, where the hidden nature of the experiments and procedures carried out there reinforced both the authority of the medical system and the emotional uncertainty experienced by those confined inside the block, and this secrecy shaped daily existence within the building continuously, and as one reflects on the physical appearance of Block 10 from outside, it becomes clear that the structure itself revealed little about the activities unfolding within its walls, where ordinary brick construction, guarded entrances, shuttered or covered windows, and restricted movement contributed to an atmosphere of mystery surrounding the building, and this external silence contrasted sharply with the emotional and physical suffering taking place inside, reinforcing the broader disconnect between appearance and reality that defined much of Auschwitz itself, and as this develops further, the role of isolation becomes increasingly significant, where women imprisoned inside Block 10 often experience separation not only from the outside world but also from broader prisoner communities within the camp, and this isolation intensified the psychological atmosphere of the building by surrounding daily life with uncertainty and limited access to information. And as we consider the sensory aspects of existence inside the block, it becomes evident that the atmosphere carried a constant tension shaped by enclosed spaces, footsteps moving through narrow hallways, opening and closing doors, distant sounds from examination rooms, whispered communication between prisoners, and long stretches of quietness, interrupted by sudden administrative activity, and this sensory environment reinforced awareness that Block 10 functioned according to hidden routines controlled entirely by institutional authority, and as this develops, the relationship between visibility and concealment becomes increasingly apparent, where prisoners inside the building observed fragments of procedures, routines, and movement while still lacking full understanding of the broader experimental system operating around them, and this partial awareness shaped the psychological environment by surrounding ordinary routines with unanswered questions and fear regarding what remained hidden behind closed doors and administrative secrecy. And as one reflects on the broader implications, it becomes evident that the hidden character of Block 10 represented an important aspect of how medical experimentation functioned inside Auschwitz, where secrecy protected institutional authority, limited external awareness, and reinforced the isolation of those subjected to procedures inside the building, and this concealment contributed heavily to the emotional atmosphere later associated with Block 10 after the war. And as this develops further, the role of observation becomes increasingly interconnected with survival, where prisoners relied upon careful attention to changes in routine, doctor behavior, movement through corridors, and the emotional condition of others inside the wards in order to interpret the environment surrounding them, and this dependence upon observation reflected the broader survival strategies necessary throughout the camp, while becoming especially intense inside the closed world of Block 10. And as we consider the perspective of women living inside the building for extended periods, it becomes clear that the hidden nature of the block shaped emotional existence profoundly by creating an environment where institutional secrecy, restricted visibility, and uncertainty became ordinary conditions of daily life, and this atmosphere contributed heavily to later memories, describing Block 10 as a place existing almost separately from the rest of Auschwitz itself. And as this develops, the connection between concealment, isolation, and institutional control becomes increasingly interconnected, where each element reinforced the others in shaping the operation. An atmosphere of Block 10, and thus the building can be understood as a hidden world within Auschwitz, where secrecy and restricted visibility became central tools in maintaining systems of experimentation, fear, and psychological domination. As daily life continued behind the closed windows and restricted corridors of Block 10, the atmosphere of concealment surrounding the building increasingly shaped how prisoners understood both the environment around them and their own place within it, and it becomes evident that the hidden nature of the block extended beyond physical isolation alone, because secrecy itself became part of the psychological structure governing daily existence inside the building, where limited information, restricted movement, and fragmented awareness created an environment in which uncertainty surrounded nearly every aspect of routine. And as this develops, the relationship between hidden knowledge and emotional pressure becomes increasingly significant, where prisoners inside Block 10 often sensed that they existed within a system larger and more complex than what they could directly observe, and this awareness intensified the emotional atmosphere by surrounding ordinary routines with fear of unknown procedures, institutional decisions, and unseen consequences, and as one reflects on the internal structure of the building, it becomes clear that corridors, examination rooms, wards, and enclosed spaces functioned not only as physical environments but as instruments shaping emotional experience itself. Where doors separated prisoners from information, movement remained tightly controlled, and access to understanding depended heavily upon observation and interpretation of small details within daily routine, and this structure reinforced the atmosphere of secrecy defining Block 10. And as this develops further, the role of silence becomes increasingly apparent, where long periods of waiting inside wards often unfolded beneath subdued quietness interrupted only by footsteps, movement of medical personnel, whispered communication, or sounds emerging from behind examination room doors, and this silence carried enormous psychological significance because it heightened awareness of uncertainty and institutional control inside the confined environment. And as we consider the sensory aspects of the hidden world inside Block 10, it becomes evident that even ordinary sounds acquired emotional meaning within the building, where approaching footsteps, sudden movement through corridors, preparation of medical spaces, and the opening of doors signaled possible examinations or procedures connected directly to fear and suffering. And as this develops, the relationship between institutional secrecy and psychological isolation becomes increasingly interconnected, where the inability to fully understand the broader purpose of procedures or predict future actions intensified emotional exhaustion among prisoners confined inside the building, and this uncertainty transformed daily existence into a continuous process of anticipation and interpretation, and as one reflects on the broader implications, it becomes evident that Block 10 demonstrated how authoritarian systems use concealment not only to hide actions from the outside world but also to deepen psychological domination within confined populations, where restricted access to information and controlled visibility become mechanisms shaping fear, dependence, and emotional instability, and this realization remains central to historical understanding of the block and its operation within Auschwitz. And as this develops further, the role of memory becomes increasingly central, where survivors later described not only the procedures carried out inside Block 10 but the atmosphere of secrecy itself, recalling the emotional weight of closed doors, hidden rooms, quiet corridors, and constant uncertainty surrounding daily life inside the building, and these recollections preserve the psychological reality of confinement within a space designed specifically to isolate and conceal. And as we consider the perspective of women enduring prolonged imprisonment inside Block 10, it becomes clear that survival depended heavily upon maintaining awareness within an environment structured around secrecy and institutional control, and this emotional endurance shaped the lived experience of the block even as the systems surrounding them attempted to reduce prisoners to silent subjects inside a hidden medical world. And as this develops, the connection between secrecy, emotional isolation, and institutional authority becomes increasingly interconnected, where each element reinforced the others in shaping the psychological environment of Block 10. And thus, the building can be understood as a concealed world within Auschwitz where silence, restricted visibility, and hidden routine operated continuously as part of a broader system of experimentation, fear, and psychological domination hidden behind the closed windows of the block. Chapter 4, Segment 1. The broader system behind Block 10. As one considers Auschwitz Block 10 within the wider structure of the camp system, it becomes evident that the building did not function as an isolated institution separated from the broader mechanisms of Nazi administration and ideology, but instead operated as part of a larger network, where medicine, bureaucracy, racial policy, and institutional control became deeply interconnected, and as this develops, the relationship between Block 10 and the wider organization of Auschwitz becomes increasingly central to understanding how the experiments carried out inside the building were made possible, where transportation systems, registration procedures, prisoner selection processes, camp administration, and medical authority all contributed to sustaining the environment in which experimentation on imprisoned women could occur, and this broader context shaped the meaning of Block 10 itself. And as one reflects on the structure of Auschwitz during this period, it becomes clear that the camp functioned through layers of administrative organization designed to regulate movement, labor, confinement, and medical supervision across thousands of prisoners, and within this structure, Block 10 occupied a specialized role connected directly to the broader ideological and scientific ambitions of the Nazi regime, and this integration reinforced the understanding that the building existed not outside the system but deeply within it, and as this develops further, the role of racial ideology becomes increasingly significant, where Nazi theories concerning biology, population control, heredity, and racial classification shaped many of the experimental objectives pursued inside Block 10, and these ideological assumptions transformed medicine itself into a tool supporting broader systems of exclusion and domination, and this relationship between ideology and scientific authority became one of the defining characteristics of the building's operation. And as we consider the sensory atmosphere surrounding Auschwitz as a whole, it becomes evident that Block 10 existed within a much larger environment shaped by transportation activity, guard patrols, administrative movement, industrial labor, overcrowded barracks, medical inspections, and continuous systems of surveillance. And although the building itself remained relatively concealed and isolated, it still functioned within the rhythms of the broader camp, connected to structures of authority operating across the entire environment. And as this develops, the relationship between institutional routine and dehumanization becomes increasingly apparent, where registration systems, examinations, classifications, schedules, and administrative decisions reduced prisoners to categories and records within bureaucratic structures that prioritized ideology and efficiency above human dignity, and this transformation of individuals into subjects of administration shaped not only the operation of Block 10 but the wider structure of Auschwitz itself. And as one reflects on the broader implications, it becomes evident that Block 10 revealed how ordinary institutional systems associated with medicine, research, transportation, and bureaucracy can become integrated into structures of oppression when guided by authoritarian ideology and stripped of ethical restraint, and this realization remains central to the historical significance of the building, because it demonstrates that the experiments carried out there depended upon the cooperation and organization of a much larger institutional environment. And as this develops further, the role of professional authority becomes increasingly interconnected with systems of control, where doctors, administrators, guards, and medical staff each occupied positions within a broader hierarchy governing the operation of the block and the camp surrounding it, and this hierarchy reinforced the imbalance of power defining daily life inside Block 10 by placing institutional objectives above the humanity of those imprisoned within the building. And as we consider the perspective of women confined inside Block 10, it becomes clear that the broader systems surrounding Auschwitz shaped their existence continuously, even when hidden behind the closed doors of the building itself, where transportation networks, selections, administrative decisions, and ideological structures determined who entered the block, how procedures unfolded, and whether prisoners survived, and this awareness connected the isolated atmosphere of Block 10 directly to the wider operation of the camp system, and as this develops, the connection between bureaucracy, ideology, and medical experimentation becomes increasingly interconnected, where each element reinforced the others in sustaining the environment inside Block 10, and thus the building can be understood not as a separate anomaly within Auschwitz but as part of a larger institutional structure in which administration, racial ideology, scientific authority, and systems of confinement merged together under Nazi rule. As one reflects further upon the wider institutional systems surrounding Block 10, it becomes increasingly evident that the experiments carried out inside the building depended not only upon individual doctors or isolated decisions, but upon the cooperation of an entire administrative environment structured around hierarchy, organization, and ideological obedience, and as this develops, the relationship between bureaucracy and violence becomes increasingly central to understanding the operation of Auschwitz itself, where procedures associated outwardly with administration and medical routine functioned within systems designed to regulate human bodies according to racial theories and institutional priorities rather than ethical responsibility, and this integration transformed ordinary organizational structures into mechanisms supporting experimentation and confinement, and as one considers the broader medical network operating throughout Auschwitz, it becomes clear that infirmaries, examination rooms, quarantine areas, registration offices, and experimental wards existed within a connected system where medical authority served administrative and ideological purposes alongside limited forms of treatment, and Block 10 emerged as one of the most extreme expressions of this structure because it concentrated experimentation, secrecy, and institutional power within a single controlled environment, and as this develops further, the role of documentation becomes increasingly significant, where records, classifications, schedules, reports, and medical observations formed part of the broader administrative routine surrounding the building, and these systems of documentation contributed to the dehumanizing atmosphere of the camp by reducing prisoners to entries within institutional processes disconnected from personal dignity or consent, and as we consider the sensory environment surrounding the broader camp system, it becomes evident that Auschwitz functioned through continuous movement and organization, where trains arrived along railway lines, guards moved between compounds, labor details crossed the camp, administrative offices processed information, and medical staff traveled through restricted areas carrying out inspections and procedures, and within this larger machinery of routine, Block 10 remained one hidden section operating according to its own tightly controlled rhythm while still connected to the broader structure surrounding it, and as this develops, the relationship between specialization and institutional control becomes increasingly apparent, where different sections of Auschwitz served distinct functions connected to labor, imprisonment, medical supervision, administration, and experimentation, and Block 10 reflected how highly organized systems can divide responsibility across institutions in ways that obscure the full moral reality of the larger structure itself, and this fragmentation of responsibility remains historically important when examining how authoritarian systems sustain large-scale abuses through bureaucracy and professional hierarchy, and as one reflects on the broader implications, it becomes evident that the operation of Block 10 demonstrated how scientific authority and institutional administration can become dangerous when disconnected from ethical limits and human accountability, where professional Expertise, medical language, and bureaucratic efficiency were redirected toward systems of coercion and racial ideology under state control, and this transformation remains one of the central historical lessons associated with Auschwitz and Nazi medical experimentation more broadly, and as this develops further, the role of emotional distance within bureaucratic systems becomes increasingly interconnected with the operation of the block, where procedures, records, classifications, and administrative routines created structures that allowed suffering to become abstracted into institutional process rather than confronted as human reality, and this emotional separation reinforced the dehumanizing atmosphere surrounding Block 10 and the broader camp system itself, and as we consider the perspective of the imprisoned women inside the building, it becomes clear that their daily existence was shaped not only by the immediate presence of doctors and guards, but by the vast administrative and ideological systems operating invisibly behind the walls of the block, and this awareness connects the intimate suffering experienced within Block 10 directly to the broader machinery of Auschwitz as an organized institution, and as this develops, the connection between bureaucracy, medical authority, and ideological control becomes increasingly interconnected, where each element reinforced the others in shaping the operation of Block 10 within the larger camp environment, and thus the building can be understood as part of a broader institutional system in which administration, scientific authority, transportation, ideology, and confinement merged together into one organized structure of control. Operating throughout Auschwitz. Chapter 4, Segment 2. The atmosphere of Auschwitz beyond Block 10. As one considers the experience of imprisonment inside Block 10, it becomes increasingly important to understand the broader atmosphere of Auschwitz surrounding the building itself, because the emotional and physical reality inside the block remained inseparable from the larger camp environment operating beyond its walls, and as this develops, the relationship between isolation and surrounding structure becomes increasingly central to understanding how Block 10 functioned within Auschwitz, where the building existed simultaneously as a hidden and restricted medical space and as part of an enormous camp system shaped by labor, transportation, surveillance, overcrowding, and administrative control, and this broader environment influenced daily existence inside the block continuously, even when prisoners rarely left its confined corridors and wards, and as one reflects on the physical landscape surrounding Block 10, it becomes clear that Auschwitz operated through highly organized divisions of space, where fences, guard towers, barracks, roads, railway connections, work details, medical buildings, and administrative offices formed a structured environment governed by movement, supervision, and routine, and within this landscape, Block 10 remained relatively concealed yet deeply connected to the larger machinery of the camp itself, and as this develops further, the role of sound becomes increasingly significant, where the atmosphere surrounding the building carried echoes of the wider camp beyond its walls, including distant commands, movement of labor columns, whistles, guard patrols, opening gates, transport activity, and footsteps across camp roads, and these surrounding sounds reinforced awareness among prisoners inside Block 10 that the broader structure of Auschwitz continued operating constantly beyond the restricted medical environment. Enclosing them, and as we consider the sensory aspects of this relationship between the block and the wider camp, it becomes evident that daily life inside Block 10 unfolded within layers of atmosphere, where the quieter tension of the medical wards existed alongside the larger industrial rhythm of Auschwitz itself, and this contrast shaped emotional perception inside the building by surrounding confined routines with awareness of the vast institutional system operating outside. And as this develops, the relationship between confinement and visibility becomes increasingly apparent, where women imprisoned inside Block 10 remained physically separated from much of ordinary camp life while still witnessing fragments of the outside environment through windows, corridors, movement between rooms, or distant sounds carried across the camp. And these glimpses reinforced the understanding that the block existed not independently but as one part of a much larger structure of control, and as one reflects on the broader implications, it becomes evident that Auschwitz functioned through systems designed to organize human movement, labor, health, punishment, and administration according to centralized authority, and Block 10 represented one specialized section within this structure where medical experimentation and ideological objectives became concentrated, and this integration remains essential to understanding the historical meaning of the building because it reveals how isolated acts of experimentation depended upon the operation of the broader camp environment surrounding them, and as this develops further, the role of emotional awareness becomes increasingly interconnected with sensory perception, where prisoners inside Block 10 interpreted distant activity, changes in atmosphere, guard behavior, transportation movement, and broader camp rhythms as part of their understanding of daily existence inside the building, and this awareness shaped the psychological environment of the block by constantly reminding prisoners that they remained trapped within the larger systems of Auschwitz itself. And as we consider the perspective of women confined inside Block 10 for extended periods, it becomes clear that the surrounding camp environment influenced emotional life continuously even within the isolated medical wards, where sounds, movement, and fragments of visibility connected the hidden world of the building to the larger machinery of confinement operating outside, and this connection shaped memory of the block long after the war, and as this develops, the connection between isolation, institutional structure, and sensory atmosphere becomes increasingly interconnected, where each element reinforced the others in shaping the experience of imprisonment inside Block 10, and thus the building can be understood not only as an isolated site of experimentation but as a concealed section within the wider environment of Auschwitz, where medical authority and psychological confinement existed alongside the vast systems of labor, surveillance, and administration shaping the camp as a whole. As daily life inside Block 10 continued beneath the constant presence of the broader Auschwitz environment surrounding it, the emotional atmosphere of the building increasingly reflected the larger systems of organization and control operating throughout the camp, and it becomes evident that the hidden medical world inside the block could never be fully separated from the industrial, administrative, and psychological structure of Auschwitz itself, because the routines, selections, transportation systems, guard patrols, and institutional authority shaping the wider camp also influenced the rhythms and emotional reality experienced by the women confined inside Block 10, and as this develops, the relationship between hidden confinement and visible camp routine becomes increasingly significant, where prisoners inside the building existed in partial separation from ordinary camp life while remaining continuously aware of the larger machinery operating beyond the walls surrounding them, and this awareness shaped how they interpreted both their own confinement and the environment outside, and as one reflects on the physical surroundings of Block 10, it becomes clear that the building stood within a landscape dominated by structures of authority and organization, where roads connected compounds, fences divided space, guards controlled movement, and administrative routines regulated daily life across the camp, and this environment reinforced the understanding that Block 10 functioned as one specialized component within a broader institutional system rather than as an isolated medical facility detached from the structures surrounding it, and as this develops further, the role of transportation and movement becomes increasingly apparent, where trains arriving in Auschwitz, labor details crossing camp, roads, administrative activity, and movement between compounds formed part of the daily sensory environment surrounding Block 10, and even when women inside the building remained confined to wards and corridors, they still experienced fragments of these larger rhythms through distant sounds, visible motion, and changing activity around the camp itself. And as we consider the sensory aspects of this broader atmosphere, it becomes evident that Auschwitz carried a continuous rhythm shaped by whistles, footsteps, shouted commands, opening gates, transportation noise, guard movement, and industrial activity, and within this larger environment, the quieter but deeply tense atmosphere of Block 10 existed almost as a concealed layer hidden beneath the visible routines of the camp, and this contrast intensified the emotional isolation associated with the building because prisoners remained aware that life beyond the block continued according to systems they could hear and partially observe but not fully access. And as this develops, the relationship between observation and psychological survival becomes increasingly interconnected, where women inside Block 10 interpreted changes in the wider camp atmosphere through subtle shifts in movement, sound, administrative routine, and guard behavior, using fragments of sensory information to understand the environment surrounding them, and this careful attention to external rhythm became part of emotional adaptation inside the confined medical wards. And as one reflects on the broader implications, it becomes evident that Auschwitz functioned not only through physical structures of imprisonment but through carefully organized systems of atmosphere, routine, and psychological control that shaped how prisoners experienced space, time, and uncertainty, and Block 10 represented one of the most intense examples of this reality because it concentrated medical authority, secrecy, and emotional isolation within the larger machinery of the camp, and this integration remains central to understanding the historical meaning of the building within Auschwitz itself. And as this develops further, the role of institutional scale becomes increasingly significant, where the vastness of Auschwitz as a transportation, labor, administrative, and medical complex reinforced the sense of powerlessness experienced by women inside Block 10, and this awareness shaped the emotional atmosphere of the building by constantly connecting individual suffering to the enormous structures of authority operating outside its walls. And as we consider the perspective of prisoners confined within the block for extended periods, it becomes clear that the surrounding environment of Auschwitz remained psychologically present even during moments of isolation, where distant sounds, visible movement, and awareness of the camp beyond the building continuously shaped emotional perception and memory, and this connection contributed heavily to later recollections describing Block 10 as both hidden and inseparable from the broader reality of Auschwitz itself. And as this develops, the connection between atmosphere, institutional organization, and psychological confinement becomes increasingly interconnected, where each element reinforced the others in shaping life inside Block 10, and thus the building can be understood as a concealed medical world existing within the wider environment of Auschwitz, where secrecy, experimentation, and emotional isolation operated continuously beneath the larger systems of transportation, labor, surveillance, and institutional authority governing the camp as a whole. Chapter 4, Segment 3. The Collapse of the Camp System and the Fate of Block 10. As one considers the final phase of Auschwitz and the eventual collapse of the camp system, during the closing months of the war, the atmosphere surrounding Block 10 began to change. Alongside the broader transformation unfolding across the camp itself, and it becomes evident that The building, once defined by secrecy, controlled medical routine, and institutional stability under Nazi administration, gradually entered a period marked by uncertainty, disruption, and visible signs that the larger structures sustaining Auschwitz were beginning to weaken, and as this develops, the relationship between institutional collapse and psychological atmosphere becomes increasingly central to understanding the final period inside Block 10, where prisoners confined within the building observed changes in routine, movement, administration, and surrounding camp activity that reflected the growing instability affecting Auschwitz as a whole, and this awareness shaped emotional perception inside the block during its final months of operation, and as one reflects on the broader wartime situation during this stage, it becomes clear that military developments across Eastern Europe increasingly influenced the atmosphere inside concentration camps connected to the Nazi system, where advancing Soviet forces disrupted transportation networks, shortages, and growing administrative anxiety gradually altered the operation of camps that had previously appeared rigidly organized and permanent, and these broader developments reached Auschwitz itself, reshaping the routines and emotional environment surrounding both the camp and Block 10, and as this develops further, the role of uncertainty becomes increasingly significant, where prisoners inside the building notice changes in guard behavior, administrative movement, scheduling of procedures, and the general atmosphere of the camp, and this growing instability created a psychological environment different from earlier periods of controlled routine, because the institutional order governing daily life no longer appeared entirely stable or predictable, and as we consider the sensory aspects of Auschwitz during this final phase, it becomes evident that the camp carried a changing atmosphere shaped by increased tension, movement of officials, disrupted schedules, transportation activity connected to evacuations, distant military awareness, and shifting rhythms across compounds and administrative areas, and within this environment, Block 10 remained physically enclosed yet increasingly influenced by the broader instability unfolding throughout the camp, and as this develops, the relationship between secrecy and collapse becomes increasingly apparent, where the hidden nature of Block 10 remained present even as the larger camp system surrounding it entered visible crisis, and this contrast created an atmosphere in which prisoners experienced both continued confinement and growing awareness that the structures maintaining institutional authority were beginning to fracture, and as one reflects on the broader implications, it becomes evident that the collapse of Auschwitz revealed how even highly organized systems of control and administration depend ultimately upon larger political, military, and logistical structures for their continuation, and when those broader systems weakened during the final phase of the war, the routines, procedures, and institutional certainty defining places like Block 10 also began to deteriorate, and this transformation altered the emotional environment inside the building itself, and as this develops further, the role of observation becomes increasingly interconnected with hope and uncertainty, where prisoners inside Block 10 carefully interpreted rumors, changes in routine, reduced administrative consistency, and visible signs of instability throughout Auschwitz in order to understand what might happen next, and this dependence upon observation reflected the broader survival strategies shaping life throughout the camp while becoming especially intense during the final months of institutional collapse, and as we consider the perspective of women confined inside Block 10 during this period, it becomes clear that daily existence unfolded within an atmosphere suspended between fear of continued suffering and fragile awareness that the broader structures surrounding Auschwitz were beginning to weaken, and this emotional uncertainty shaped memory of the final months inside the building, and as this develops, the connection between institutional instability, psychological tension, and the erosion of administrative routine becomes increasingly interconnected, where each element reinforced the others in shaping the atmosphere of Block 10 during the collapse of Auschwitz, and thus the final phase of the building's operation can be understood as a period in which the hidden medical world inside Block 10 became increasingly affected by the visible unraveling of the larger camp system, sustaining it. As the collapse of Auschwitz moved closer during the final months of the war, the atmosphere surrounding Block 10 became increasingly shaped by fragmentation, uncertainty, and the gradual breakdown of the institutional systems that had previously governed every aspect of daily life inside the building, and it becomes evident that the routines of examinations, supervision, and medical procedure no longer unfolded with the same rigid consistency that had once defined the block, because the broader structures of transportation, administration, communication, and authority supporting Auschwitz itself were beginning to deteriorate under the pressure of advancing military forces and the approaching end of Nazi control in the region. And as this develops, the relationship between institutional collapse and emotional perception becomes increasingly significant, where prisoners inside Block 10 experienced the changing atmosphere, not through direct knowledge of military events alone, but through subtle disruptions in routine, changes in behavior among guards and officials, reduced administrative order, and the growing sense that the environment surrounding them was becoming unstable, and this awareness shaped the emotional reality of the final weeks inside the building. And as one reflects on the physical atmosphere of Auschwitz during this stage, it becomes clear that the camp no longer resembled the tightly organized environment it had once been, where transportation patterns shifted, evacuations altered movement across compounds, administrative priorities changed rapidly, and tension spread throughout both prisoner populations and camp personnel. And within this changing environment, Block 10 remained physically enclosed yet psychologically connected to the broader collapse unfolding outside its walls. And as this develops further, the role of silence becomes increasingly apparent, where uncertainty regarding the future created periods of emotional stillness interrupted by sudden activity connected to orders, transfers, evacuations, or movement of guards and officials through the camp, and this unstable rhythm differed sharply from the repetitive routines that had previously defined daily life inside the block, reinforcing awareness that the institutional structure governing Auschwitz was beginning to fail. And as we consider the sensory aspects of this period, it becomes evident that the atmosphere of the camp carried signs of disintegration through hurried movement, altered schedules, distant military awareness, disrupted routines, and the emotional tension visible across the environment itself. And prisoners inside Block 10 interpreted these changes carefully, relying upon observation of both the building and the wider camp to understand the uncertain future approaching around them. And as this develops, the relationship between secrecy and disappearance becomes increasingly interconnected, where the hidden world of Block 10 began gradually dissolving alongside the larger systems that had sustained it, and this transformation altered the emotional meaning of the building because the institutional certainty once defining its operation no longer appeared permanent or secure. And as one reflects on the broader implications, it becomes evident that the collapse of Auschwitz demonstrated how systems of control that once seemed absolute could unravel rapidly when the larger political and military structures supporting them disintegrated. And this realization shaped the final atmosphere of Block 10 by surrounding continued fear and suffering with growing awareness that the camp itself was approaching its end. And as this develops further, the role of memory becomes increasingly central, where survivors later recalled not only the earlier periods of experimentation and confinement but also the strange emotional atmosphere of the final months, when routines weakened, uncertainty spread, and the hidden world of the block became connected to the visible collapse of Auschwitz around it, and these recollections preserve the emotional transition from institutional stability toward disintegration. Within the building itself, and as we consider the perspective of women enduring confinement inside Block 10 during this final phase, it becomes clear that emotional survival depended increasingly upon interpreting the changing atmosphere surrounding them while enduring the continuing uncertainty of a collapsing camp system, and this awareness shaped the psychological reality of the last period of imprisonment inside the block, and as this develops, the connection between collapse, uncertainty, and the erosion of institutional authority becomes increasingly interconnected, where each element reinforced the others in shaping the final atmosphere of Block 10, and thus the building can be understood as a hidden medical environment whose operation gradually dissolved alongside the broader collapse of Auschwitz itself, transforming the atmosphere of confinement from one of rigid institutional control into one marked by instability, fragmentation, and the approaching end of the camp system. Chapter 5, Segment 1. Memory, Testimony, and the Survivors of Block 10. As one reflects upon Auschwitz Block 10 after the collapse of the camp system and the end of the war, the building increasingly becomes understood not only as a physical location within Auschwitz but as a lasting symbol of how medical authority, institutional secrecy, and ideological power were combined within one of the most disturbing environments of the 20th century. And as this develops, the relationship between memory and testimony becomes increasingly central to understanding the historical legacy of Block 10, because much of what is known about daily life inside the building emerged through the recollections of survivors who endured its routines, procedures, and psychological atmosphere, and these testimonies preserve details of the block that official records alone could never fully communicate, and as one reflects on the role of survivor memory, it becomes clear that recollections of Block 10 often focused not only upon the experiments themselves but upon the emotional environment surrounding daily existence inside the building, where silence, waiting, fear, footsteps in corridors, whispered communication, uncertainty regarding examinations, and the constant atmosphere of institutional control shaped how prisoners experienced confinement inside the block, and these sensory and emotional memories remain essential to historical understanding because they reveal how psychological oppression functioned alongside physical suffering within the hidden medical environment of Auschwitz, and as this develops further, the role of testimony becomes increasingly significant, where survivors described the atmosphere of isolation defining Block 10, recalling covered windows, restricted movement, examination rooms, crowded wards, and the sense that the building existed as a concealed world within the larger camp system surrounding it, and these recollections preserve the emotional reality of confinement in ways that administrative documents and medical records alone cannot capture, and as we consider the sensory dimensions of memory itself, it becomes evident that many survivors remembered Block 10 through recurring impressions connected to sound, space, and routine, where footsteps approaching doors, movement of guards and doctors, silence inside wards, whispered exchanges between prisoners, and the emotional tension surrounding examinations remained deeply fixed within memory long after liberation, and this persistence of sensory detail demonstrates how profoundly the atmosphere of the block shaped those who endured it, and as this develops, the relationship between trauma and recollection becomes increasingly apparent, where survivors often carried memories not only of procedures and physical suffering but also of prolonged uncertainty, emotional isolation, and the constant awareness that institutional authority extended directly into their bodies and daily existence, and this psychological dimension remains central to understanding the lived experience inside Block 10 beyond the medical history of the experiments. Alone, and as one reflects on the broader implications, it becomes evident that survivor testimony transformed Block 10 from a hidden and isolated section of Auschwitz into a historically documented environment whose operation could no longer remain concealed after the war, and this process of testimony and remembrance played an essential role in exposing the realities of Nazi medical experimentation to later generations, ensuring that the secrecy surrounding the building did not survive the collapse of the camp system itself, and as this develops further, the role of emotional endurance becomes increasingly interconnected with memory, where survivors recalled not only fear and suffering but also moments of observation, quiet support between prisoners, awareness of shared experience, and the persistence of emotional survival within an environment specifically designed to isolate and dominate, and these recollections preserve the humanity of those imprisoned inside the block despite the institutional systems that attempted to reduce them to experimental subjects, and as we consider the perspective of later generations encountering the history of Block 10, it becomes clear that survivor testimony remains one of the most important means through which the emotional atmosphere of the building can still be understood today, because memory carries dimensions of fear, silence, routine, and psychological reality that cannot be reconstructed fully through physical remains or administrative records alone, and this understanding shapes how the building is remembered historically, and as this develops, the connection between testimony, memory, and historical responsibility becomes increasingly interconnected, where each element reinforces the others in preserving awareness of what occurred inside Block 10, and thus the legacy of the building can be understood not only through its role within Auschwitz itself but through the voices and memories of the women who survived its hidden world and ensured that its atmosphere of secrecy and suffering would not disappear from history. As survivor testimony concerning Block 10 continued to emerge after the war, the historical understanding of the building increasingly became shaped by the emotional depth and personal detail contained within these recollections, and it becomes evident that memory of Block 10 carried a unique intensity because survivors often described not only the visible routines and procedures inside the building but the atmosphere of fear, anticipation, and emotional isolation that defined daily life there, and as this develops, the relationship between personal memory and historical record becomes increasingly significant, where testimony transformed individual recollections into part of the broader historical understanding of Auschwitz and Nazi medical experimentation, ensuring that the hidden environment inside Block 10 could be studied and remembered by later generations, and this process gave lasting historical visibility to a building once designed to operate through secrecy and restricted access, and as one reflects on the emotional structure of survivor recollections, it becomes clear that many memories centered upon ordinary sensory experiences inside the block, where silence in the wards, footsteps approaching corridors, movement toward examination rooms, whispered conversations between prisoners, and the emotional tension surrounding medical procedures remained deeply fixed within memory. And These details preserve the psychological atmosphere of the building in ways that extend beyond descriptions of the experiments themselves, and as this develops further, the role of emotional survival becomes increasingly apparent, where survivors often recalled how observation, quiet communication, shared awareness, and limited acts of emotional support between prisoners became essential to enduring life inside the block, and these memories reveal that even within an environment dominated by institutional control and fear, forms of human connection continued to exist, shaping the lived reality of daily existence inside Block 10, and as we consider the sensory aspects of memory after trauma, it becomes evident that recollections of the block frequently return to recurring impressions connected to confinement and uncertainty, where enclosed corridors, restricted movement, waiting before examinations, sounds of doors opening, and the presence of doctors and guards shaped emotional memory continuously, and this persistence demonstrates how deeply the environment of Block 10 affected those imprisoned there, extending its psychological influence long beyond the physical period of confinement itself, and as this develops, the relationship between testimony and historical responsibility becomes increasingly interconnected, where survivor accounts challenged attempts to minimize or obscure the realities of Nazi medical experimentation by preserving direct human experience within the historical record, and this role of testimony remains essential because it confronts later generations with the emotional and moral reality of what occurred inside the building rather than allowing Block 10 to remain understood only through institutional documentation or abstract historical analysis, and as one reflects on the broader implications, it becomes evident that the survivors of Block 10 carried not only memories of suffering but also the burden of preserving awareness of a hidden environment that many outside Auschwitz never fully understood during the war itself, and this responsibility shaped how testimony concerning the building entered public historical consciousness after liberation, contributing to broader discussions regarding medical ethics, institutional authority, and the dangers created when science becomes separated from human dignity and moral restraint. And as this develops further, the role of remembrance becomes increasingly central, where memorialization of Block 10 depends heavily upon preserving the voices and emotional experiences of those who endured its routines, procedures, and atmosphere of secrecy, and this process of remembrance ensures that the building is understood not simply as a physical location within Auschwitz but as a human environment shaped by fear, endurance, observation, and survival. And as we consider the perspective of modern audiences learning about Block 10 today, it becomes clear that survivor testimony remains one of the most powerful ways to understand the emotional reality of life inside the building because it preserves details of routine, atmosphere, and psychological experience that no physical reconstruction alone could fully communicate, and this understanding shapes the continuing historical significance of Block 10 within Holocaust memory, and as this develops, the connection between remembrance, testimony, and ethical reflection becomes increasingly interconnected, where each element reinforces the others in preserving awareness of the hidden world that once existed behind the closed windows of the building, and thus the memory of Block 10 survives today largely through the testimonies of the women who endured its atmosphere of fear, secrecy, and experimentation, ensuring that the building remains part of historical consciousness and moral reflection long after the collapse of Auschwitz itself. Chapter 5, Segment 2. The Historical Meaning of Block 10. As one reflects upon the lasting historical meaning of Auschwitz Block 10, it becomes evident that the building occupies a unique and deeply significant place within the broader history of Auschwitz, Nazi medical experimentation, and the 20th century itself. And as this develops, the relationship between medicine, institutional authority, and ideology becomes increasingly central to understanding why Block 10 continues to be studied and remembered long after the collapse of the camp system, where the building revealed with unusual clarity how scientific structures and professional authority could become integrated into systems of coercion, racial ideology, and human experimentation under authoritarian rule, and this transformation shaped the historical legacy of the block in profound ways, and as one reflects on the physical environment of Block 10 during the war, it becomes clear that the building outwardly resembled an ordinary institutional structure within Auschwitz, where corridors, wards, examination rooms, administrative routines, and medical procedures created the appearance of organized clinical order, and yet beneath this appearance existed a system in which imprisoned women were denied autonomy, consent, and protection while being subjected to experimentation and coercive procedures carried out under the authority of doctors and medical personnel, and this contradiction remains central to the historical meaning of the building itself. And as this develops further, the role of professional authority becomes increasingly significant, where doctors inside Block 10 occupied positions associated socially with knowledge, healing, and institutional trust. And the misuse of this authority within Auschwitz demonstrated how professional expertise can become dangerous when detached from ethical responsibility and subordinated to ideology and state power, and this lesson extends far beyond the specific historical circumstances of the camp itself. And as we consider the sensory atmosphere associated with memory of Block 10, it becomes evident that the building continues to evoke images of enclosed corridors, silent wards, footsteps approaching examination rooms, covered windows, restricted movement, and emotional uncertainty, and these recurring impressions preserve the atmosphere of secrecy and psychological tension that shaped daily existence inside the block, contributing to its enduring symbolic significance within Holocaust history. And as this develops, the relationship between institutional routine and dehumanization becomes increasingly apparent, where registration systems, examinations, schedules, medical classifications, and administrative procedures transformed imprisoned women into objects of experimentation within a larger bureaucratic structure, and this reduction of human beings into institutional categories reflected broader patterns of dehumanization operating throughout Auschwitz and the Nazi camp system as a whole. And as one reflects on the broader implications, it becomes evident that Block 10 demonstrated how modern systems of organization, medicine, and bureaucracy can be directed toward profoundly destructive purposes when ethical boundaries collapse and human dignity is denied. And this realization remains one of the central historical lessons associated with the building because it challenges assumptions that scientific or administrative progress automatically leads toward moral progress. And as this develops further, the role of memory becomes increasingly interconnected with ethical reflection, where remembrance of Block 10 forces later generations to confront uncomfortable questions regarding the responsibilities of medical professionals, researchers, institutions, and governments within modern societies. And this process of reflection continues shaping discussions surrounding medical ethics and human rights today. And as we consider the perspective of those studying the history of Block 10 in the present, it becomes clear that the building survives not only as part of Auschwitz history but as a warning regarding the dangers created when institutional systems become disconnected from moral accountability. and this understanding gives the block a significance extending far beyond the physical boundaries of the camp itself, and as this develops, the connection between memory, institutional power, and ethical responsibility becomes increasingly interconnected, where each element reinforces the others in shaping the lasting historical meaning of Block 10, and thus the building can be understood as both a specific site of suffering within Auschwitz and a broader historical symbol revealing how science, authority, bureaucracy, and ideology can merge together under authoritarian systems to produce environments of coercion, secrecy, and profound human abuse. As the history of Block 10 continued to enter public awareness after the war through survivor testimony, historical research, and ethical reflection, the building increasingly became understood as one of the most revealing examples of how modern institutional systems can be transformed under authoritarian ideology, and it becomes evident that the significance of Block 10 extends far beyond the physical experiments conducted inside its walls, because the building exposed how medicine, bureaucracy, scientific ambition, and state authority could function together within a structure designed to deny autonomy and human dignity to imprisoned individuals. And as this develops, the relationship between scientific language and moral responsibility becomes increasingly significant, where procedures carried out under the appearance of research and medical advancement concealed systems of coercion operating entirely outside the principles of ethical care and consent, and this contradiction remains central to historical understanding of the building today, and as one reflects on the broader medical environment of the 20th century, it becomes clear that Block 10 emerged during a period when modern science and institutional medicine possessed enormous social authority, and the corruption of that authority inside Auschwitz demonstrated how dangerous professional systems can become when ideological obedience replaces ethical accountability, and this realization contributed heavily to post-war debates concerning medical ethics, informed consent, and the responsibilities of doctors and researchers within society. And as this develops further, the role of secrecy becomes increasingly apparent, where Block 10 operated behind restricted access, covered windows, controlled movement, and institutional concealment during the war, and yet after liberation the testimonies of survivors transformed the building from a hidden experimental space into part of documented historical memory, ensuring that the secrecy surrounding its operation could no longer survive beyond the collapse of the camp system itself. And as we consider the sensory dimensions of historical memory, it becomes evident that recollections of Block 10 continue to evoke the atmosphere of enclosed corridors, waiting inside wards, silence interrupted by footsteps, and examinations, emotional tension surrounding medical procedures, and the overwhelming uncertainty shaping daily life within the building. And these recurring sensory details preserve the emotional reality of confinement in ways that historical records alone cannot fully communicate. And as this develops, the relationship between institutional structure and individual suffering becomes increasingly interconnected, where the operation of Block 10 depended not only upon individual doctors or isolated decisions, but upon larger systems of administration, transportation, prisoner registration, camp organization, and ideological policy functioning throughout Auschwitz itself. And this integration demonstrates how modern bureaucratic systems can distribute responsibility across institutions in ways that make large-scale abuses appear routine and administratively normalized. And as one reflects on the broader implications, it becomes evident that Block 10 remains historically important because it forces later generations to confront the reality that systems associated with medicine, science, and professional expertise are never morally neutral on their own, and their ethical meaning depends entirely upon the values, accountability, and respect for human dignity guiding their use, and this realization remains one of the central lessons preserved through the history of the building. And as this develops further, the role of survivor memory becomes increasingly central to ethical reflection itself, where testimony from women imprisoned inside Block 10 transformed abstract knowledge of experimentation into direct human experience filled with emotional detail, psychological atmosphere, and lived awareness of fear and confinement, and these recollections continue shaping how later generations understand the moral reality of what occurred inside the building. And as we consider the perspective of the modern world examining Block 10 today, it becomes clear that the building survives historically not only because of the suffering experienced there, but because it revealed how easily institutional authority and scientific systems can become tools of domination when separated from ethical restraint and human responsibility, and this understanding gives Block 10 enduring relevance within discussions of medical ethics, institutional power, and human rights far beyond the historical context of Auschwitz itself. And as this develops, the connection between historical memory, ethical responsibility, and institutional awareness becomes increasingly interconnected, where each element reinforces the others in preserving the significance of Block 10 within both Holocaust history and broader reflections upon modern society, and thus the building can be understood as a lasting historical warning demonstrating how medicine, bureaucracy, ideology, and institutional power can merge together to create environments of profound human abuse when moral accountability disappears beneath systems of authority and control. Chapter 5, Segment 3. Reflection, Silence, and the Lasting Legacy of Block 10. As one reflects upon Auschwitz Block 10 in the decades following the collapse of the camp system, the building increasingly emerges not only as a historical location but as a lasting symbol of secrecy, institutional power, and the vulnerability of human dignity under authoritarian control. And as this develops, the relationship between silence and memory becomes increasingly central to understanding the enduring legacy of the block, where the quiet corridors, enclosed wards, restricted rooms, and hidden procedures that once defined daily existence inside the building continue to shape how later generations emotionally interpret the history connected to it, and this atmosphere of silence remains deeply connected to the broader moral meaning of Block 10 itself. And as one reflects on the physical structure of the building today, it becomes clear that the walls and rooms associated with Block 10 preserve more than architectural history alone, where the confined spaces, narrow hallways, covered windows, and institutional layout continue to evoke awareness of the routines, uncertainty, and emotional tension experienced by the women imprisoned there, and these physical remnants contribute to historical memory by maintaining a visible connection between present reflection and the hidden world that once operated inside Auschwitz. And as this develops further, the role of absence becomes increasingly significant, where the silence surrounding Block 10 after the war contrasts profoundly with the atmosphere that once filled the building through footsteps, examinations, whispered conversations, waiting, and fear, and this absence creates a powerful emotional contrast that reinforces awareness of what occurred there while also emphasizing the disappearance of the institutional systems that once controlled every aspect of life inside the block. And as we consider the sensory dimensions of remembrance, it becomes evident that memory of Block 10 often returns to recurring impressions connected not only to physical suffering but to atmosphere itself, where silence in the wards, sounds of approaching footsteps, opening doors, movement through corridors, and emotional anticipation surrounding medical procedures shaped the psychological experience of confinement. Inside the building, and these sensory details remain central to how the block is remembered. Historically, because they preserve the emotional environment in which experimentation and institutional control unfolded, and as this develops, the relationship between memory and ethical reflection becomes increasingly apparent, where studying Block 10 forces later generations to confront uncomfortable questions regarding the misuse of scientific authority, the responsibilities of professional institutions, and the dangers created when ideology overrides moral accountability, and this process of reflection ensures that the building remains historically significant far beyond its physical role within Auschwitz alone, and as one reflects on the broader implications, it becomes evident that Block 10 demonstrated how ordinary institutional structures associated with medicine, administration, and research can become transformed into environments of profound abuse when human beings are stripped of autonomy and dignity under authoritarian systems, and this realization remains one of the defining historical lessons associated with the building because it challenges assumptions that technical expertise or bureaucratic organization automatically produce ethical outcomes, and as this develops further, the role of survivor testimony becomes increasingly interconnected with remembrance itself, where the voices of women who endured confinement inside Block 10 continue shaping how the building is understood today, preserving emotional realities of fear, waiting, isolation, observation, and survival that no physical reconstruction alone could fully communicate, and these testimonies ensure that the hidden atmosphere of the block remains part of historical consciousness, and as we consider the perspective of modern audiences encountering the history of Block 10, it becomes clear that the building continues to evoke deep emotional reflection precisely because it combined familiar institutional forms such as corridors, examination rooms, medical routines, and administrative systems with extraordinary levels of coercion and suffering, and this contradiction forces later generations to recognize how dangerous institutional power becomes when separated from ethical responsibility, and as this develops, the connection between silence, memory, and moral awareness becomes increasingly interconnected, where each element reinforces the others, in shaping the lasting legacy of Block 10, and thus the building can be understood as both a preserved historical site within Auschwitz and a continuing warning regarding the misuse of medicine, institutional authority, and secrecy under systems that deny the humanity of those placed under their control. As the memory of Auschwitz Block 10 continues into the present, the building increasingly stands as a place where historical reflection, ethical awareness, and survivor testimony converge into a lasting reminder of how institutional systems can shape human experience under conditions of absolute power, and it becomes evident that the legacy of Block 10 extends far beyond the experiments conducted inside its walls because the building revealed how silence, secrecy, routine, and professional authority could operate together within a structure designed to control the body and psychological existence of imprisoned women, and as this develops, the relationship between remembrance and responsibility becomes increasingly significant, where studying the history of Block 10 requires not only understanding what occurred there but also confronting the broader moral lessons connected to medicine, science, and institutional authority in the modern world, and this reflection remains central to the enduring significance of the building today, and As one reflects on the atmosphere preserved through survivor testimony, it becomes clear that many memories of Block 10 focused upon ordinary details of daily existence rather than dramatic moments alone, where waiting inside wards, footsteps echoing through corridors, quiet communication between prisoners, sounds from examination rooms, and the emotional uncertainty surrounding every routine shaped the lived reality of the block itself, and these recollections preserve the psychological atmosphere of confinement in ways that continue, affecting how later generations understand the human experience inside Auschwitz. And as this develops further, the role of emotional memory becomes increasingly apparent, where survivors often described not only physical pain but the constant emotional pressure created through uncertainty, isolation, and the awareness that institutional authority extended directly into their bodies and futures, and this emotional dimension remains essential because it reveals how psychological domination functioned alongside physical experimentation within the hidden structure of Block 10, and as we consider the sensory aspects of remembrance, it becomes evident that silence itself continues to shape reflection upon the building, where the absence of the voices, movement, and fear that once filled its corridors creates a profound contrast between the preserved physical structure and the human suffering that occurred inside it, and this silence reinforces the importance of testimony and historical memory in preserving awareness of what the building once represented within Auschwitz, and as this develops, the relationship between professional ethics and historical understanding becomes increasingly interconnected, where Block 10 remains one of the clearest historical examples demonstrating how scientific systems and medical authority can become corrupted when separated from moral accountability and human dignity, and this realization continues influencing discussions surrounding medical ethics, research standards, institutional responsibility, and the protection of human rights in the modern world. And as one reflects on the broader implications, it becomes evident that the history of Block 10 challenges later generations to examine not only the past but also the structures of authority operating within contemporary societies, because the building demonstrated how ordinary institutional systems can become instruments of abuse when secrecy, ideology, and unchecked power replace ethical responsibility and transparency, and this warning gives the legacy of Block 10 enduring relevance far beyond the historical period of the Second World War itself, and as this develops further, the role of remembrance becomes increasingly central to, and public reflection ensure that the women imprisoned inside Block 10 are remembered not merely as victims of experimentation but as individuals whose experiences continue shaping ethical understanding and moral awareness today, and this preservation of memory resists the dehumanization that the institutional system once attempted to impose upon them, and as we consider the perspective of those studying Block 10 in the present, it becomes clear that the building survives historically because its atmosphere of secrecy, fear, and institutional control revealed fundamental truths regarding the dangers of authoritarian power and the misuse of medicine under ideological systems, and this understanding continues shaping the historical importance of the building within Holocaust memory and modern ethical reflection alike, and as this develops, the connection between silence, testimony, and historical responsibility becomes increasingly interconnected, where each element reinforces the others in preserving the meaning of Block 10 for future generations, and thus the lasting legacy of the building can be understood as both a warning and a memorial, reminding the modern world how easily science, authority, and institutional routine can become instruments of suffering when human dignity is abandoned. beneath systems of secrecy, ideology, and absolute control. Auschwitz Block 10 was hidden behind brick walls, covered windows, and controlled corridors, yet the silence surrounding the building concealed one of the most disturbing realities inside the camp system. Within those rooms, medicine was transformed into a tool of ideological control. Procedures replaced consent. Institutional authority replaced human dignity. And ordinary medical spaces became environments shaped by fear, uncertainty, and psychological isolation. The women imprisoned inside Block 10 endured not only physical suffering, but also the emotional weight of constant observation, secrecy, waiting, and uncertainty regarding their own futures. Their experiences revealed how deeply science, bureaucracy, and authoritarian ideology could become connected when ethical responsibility disappeared. The building remains one of the clearest historical warnings of what can happen when professional authority is separated from humanity and moral accountability. Today, Block 10 stands not only as part of Auschwitz history, but as a lasting reminder of the importance of memory, testimony, and ethical responsibility in the modern world. The voices of the survivors ensured that the hidden world inside the building did not disappear into silence after the war. Through their recollections, the atmosphere of the block, the corridors, the routines, the fear, and the struggle to survive emotionally within such confinement continues to be remembered. Studying places like Block 10 is difficult, but historical reflection remains essential because understanding how these systems operated helps preserve awareness of how institutional power can be misused when human dignity is ignored. Memory carries responsibility, and remembrance ensures that the experiences of those imprisoned there are never reduced to statistics or forgotten behind the walls where they once suffered. If you value long-form historical documentaries told with calm narration, deep research, and historical responsibility, consider subscribing to the channel. Your support helps continue these detailed explorations into history, memory, institutions, and the environments that shape some of the darkest chapters of the modern world. Thank you for watching.